Hello, Sarah.
There we go.
David, how are you doing?
Good.
Can you guys hear and see us?
I can. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, was that yes?
I can hear you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, good. Oh, Sarah, can you hear?
Yes, I can, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right. I think we'll get started then.
You're a little, I will say you're a little muddy. The audio is muddy.
That's just me.
Well, I didn't want to say that or imply it.
Well, we're trying to get the audio squared away right now. Is that any better?
It's that question is kind of like those eye tests. Pick one or two.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to speak up. Maybe that'll help.
Just quite a bit of echo. I don't know if Commissioner Hastings is having the same issue or not.
It's a little bit of an echo, you're right.
I don't know, Sarah, you can do it.
You have YouTube open? If YouTube's open, that's supposed to see it.
I do not have YouTube. No. Okay.
Yeah, see what we can do about it.
Let's see if that's any better. I think I made an adjustment.
Okay. Is this any better?
I can hear you.
Okay, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna say yes, it's fine.
Oh, that now we don't. Yeah.
I couldn't now. I couldn't hear Sarah at all. So.
Oh,
Now we can. Stop.
No. Do they have anything open? Do you know?
Oh, I lost them now.
The connection. Oh,
As much as we try to prepare the day before, the morning of,
I'm
everything's set,
bringing,
and then.
There we go.
I'm bringing the commission up.
Probably works. Martha, especially this time, with all the stuff coming in last second. And
Yeah.
quick work.
It's that time of
You
year.
do have YouTube up. It's right there. Well, whoops, right there.
Oh, okay.
All right, so let's go to that. And oh, there you go.
Okay. Thank you, Lori.
How's that? Is that any better?
it's fine.
That didn't answer my question.
Very diplomatic.
All right, well, is it useful? Can you hear what's going on?
Yes.
Manageable.
Okay, then we'll get started and maybe the IT gods will be with us and then we'll improve. We'll start with item 2 on the agenda. That's the complaint for lack of disclosure statement in mailing supporting candidate Sue Bernard. And Mr. Wayne, would you like to tell us about that?
She is, I've got her moving in.
Okay. Ms. Bernard, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
Can you hear okay?
I'm going to turn up my speakers a bit. I think I'm good now.
Great. Is there someone else who?
Oh,
Is this Mr. Haines?
Good morning.
I think you're muted, Mr. Haines.
Sorry about that. I've been waiting for 15 minutes and I had the mute on so you wouldn't hear the furnace.
Well, we appreciate it. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you fine.
All right. I think we've got everybody we need. Mr. Wayne.
Sure. Complaint by Mr. Rommy Haines about a mailing that was sent out by Representative Sue Bernard campaign. She's a candidate for state senate. And the letter that he's complaining about was signed by Mr. Ruby Dowie, who presents himself as a friend of the candidate. And
May I interrupt? I'm unable to hear.
Yeah.
Wayne.
Yeah, please.
Dealing with this and the commission and I chair, I think sometimes if people sign on with their laptops and that microphone picks up, they'll be able to hear your voice and will transmit to the application.
You mean if
So if you have your laptop,
I don't.
okay, or that microphone probably needs to get over to you and trying to move that over the speaker.
Are we using that one microphone for everybody here?
yes, and that's how it's been every meeting. So I'm with Lori. Yes, you might be able to assist me.
is it a reverberation kind of situation? Or is it more just sound quality is not good?
You're muted. You're muted, Sarah.
It can be on our end.
It's extremely muddy and some words are unintelligible.
It's
Lori,
not a feedback situation where you hear the same words over and over again.
Pardon?
Lori suggested if anyone has YouTube on Zoom as well, that might be causing a problem.
Yeah, I don't.
Does anybody have YouTube on their computer in front of them?
No.
Okay.
Not that I know of.
It must be on our end.
And I can try a speaker. I don't know if this will make a difference. Is this any better?
Can hear you.
Okay, so that's not better.
Is it any better?
Who is that?
That was Commissioner Marble.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're coming in clear.
Yeah. Commissioner Hastings, can you hear okay?
But it's not.
I've heard everybody pretty well except for Mr. Wayne.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to put your acting projecting voice.
Or if you change the speaker, that's why. The audio is no longer coming out of the TV, so I'm just concerned that YouTube having audio. So I just need to double check. I'm sorry.
Wayne has an FM voice. I apologize for that.
It seems as if it's everyone in the room as opposed to everyone outside. Like I can hear Commissioner Leclerc, I can hear Commissioner Hastings. It seems like it's everybody in your room.
You can hear the important people then.
Yeah.
Probably just need to.
Okay. Can we move that microphone closer to Mr. Wayne?
Like the table. That'd be good.
Yeah, why don't you put it on that table and,
Well, that's gonna.
I'll just move it for temporarily and then I'll move it back to the commissioners. Perfect. Thank you.
Can you hear now?
Commissioners, can you hear me any better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. This is, so getting to agenda item number 2, this is a complaint by Mr. Rommy Haines about a mailing that was sent out by the Super and Arts campaign for the state senate. The letter in question was signed by Kirby Doty, and who's a resident of Fort Fairfield, endorsing the candidate. And under Maine state law, when a mailing is sent that especially advocates for the election of a candidate, the mailing is required to state who the person who made or financed the expenditure for the mailing and whether or not it was authorized by a candidate. And the letter doesn't seem to have that disclosure on it. And the explanation from Ms. Bernard is that there were several mailings being sent out and it was a large undertaking, and somehow between getting signatures and sending the letters to the printer, the disclaimer was not added to this particular letter. And then in her written response, she also adds, or maybe I should say self-reports, that there was another letter signed by Jerry Netto that also didn't contain the disclaimer. So she's here along with her attorney to answer any questions you have or make remarks. And also Mr. Rommy Haines is also here and may want to speak to his complaint.
Does anybody on the commission have questions for Mr. Wayne before we do the mic? No. Commissioner Leclerc, Commissioner Harrison, do you have any questions for Mr. Wayne?
No, not at this time.
Okay. Mr. Haines, would you like to tell us what's behind your complaint? You're muted, Mr. Haines.
I'm sorry about that. It's not used to doing this. I just think that it's important to know who's paying for the various things that go on in these campaigns. That's the chief thing that happens. I realize that there are processes that are perfectly legal that you can disguise. You know, if somebody gives $1 million to one outfit and it goes through 3 or 4 hands and all that's legal, but at least we have a law that says voters, myself included, get to know who paid for what, and it's important. And I've known Sue for a long time, and I believe everything that was in her letter is true if she says it is. But the fact is, this is not her first rodeo. And candidates, not just her, but all candidates need to realize it's a priority that all of their staff, their volunteers, and their contractors need to be aware of this rule. So regular voters can at least see who's paying for what's going on. And that's why I filed the complaint. I know that people are reluctant to do that. I know Sue well enough that she's not going to come burn my barn down because I filed a complaint. She's not like that. And so this is just the way it should be. And you need to put the other candidates in the world on notice that they need to pay attention to this first, that this is a prerequisite for a campaign when you set it up, that everybody needs to pay attention to these disclaimers. And it's not a major crime. I understand that. But, you know, more than one person told me that they thought that a person like Kirby Dowdy could not send a mailing out like that, or at least that they could send one out. And I told them they couldn't because you have to disclose that stuff, and it didn't come from him, probably, was my guess. And I just think people should know who pays for it, and I think you should enforce the law. I realize the fact that if it was an honest mistake, mitigates the size of your action, but there are several categories or several reasons to sanction a campaign, not just whether or not the candidate was aware that it happened. The candidate is still responsible, and I think people should be able to know, and I think you should enforce that as a commission. And I thank you for your time and effort. I did read the mailing that Mr. Wayne sent carefully, and I don't know how to say I'm disappointed that we don't do a better job of supervising these candidates on this issue. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Haines.
Have
Do
a
any
nice-
commissioners have questions for Mr. Haines? Okay, Mr. Tardy, are you representing?
I am. Police Commission, I'm Joshua Tardy. I'm here with Representative Bernard. Just briefly to Mr. Haynes's comment that this isn't Representative Bernard's first rodeo. The Commission should be aware it's not Mr. Haynes's first rodeo either. The Commission may recall he was a complainant in a very highly publicized action in the last Senate race from Aroostook County, and he was in a different Senate district. But the facts here, Representative Bernard is here, who can speak to them. If the Commission has any questions, this is an unintentional disclaimer mistake. It happens in every election cycle. It happens as templates get sent to print shops, and something gets missed. In this particular case, it was a mailing activity. It was a campaign tactic, and letters were sent out. There was a volunteer effort to stuff envelopes, and in this particular case, most of the letters had the requisite disclaimers, but the print shop had made a mistake. I spoke with Mr. Wayne prior to today's hearing. I do think it's important that the Commission have an understanding of how the Commission has acted on these type of complaints in the past. And Mr. Wayne, in preparation for March 2021 disclaimer case that involved a special election here locally to Augusta, did a chart that showed how the Commission has handled these type of cases. And if you'll actually look at that chart, you'll get an understanding that the Commission has found a violation in the past and has chosen to give a sanction of $0 up to $200. The $200 case, the Collins case, the Commission in its December 2020 meeting, issued a penalty of $200. That was a person who refused to comply. There were calls made to that particular candidate to fix the disclaimer problem, and that particular person refused to participate in the Commission process. If you look at what that memo was prepared for, that was the red Hickman race replaced Secretary of State Bellows. The Commission found a violation, but also voted to issue a $0 sanction. And if you look at sort of print shop mistakes, you'll see that there's a 2016 case in which a joint mailer went out in support of the re-election of then Senator Andre Cushing and Representative Dave Hagan, and the Commission voted to assess each of those campaigns $50 fines. And so all we ever ask as an advocate coming before the Commission is for a consistent application of laws.
Thank you, Mr. Tardy. Does any commissioners have questions or comments for Mr. Tardy? Ms. LeClaire.
Just briefly, Mr. Tardy, are you saying that this violation was the result of a printer error? Because I didn't read that in Ms. Bernard's response.
there's a lot of blame that can go around in the context of the campaign, and it's always incumbent upon the campaign to be responsible for its own proofing. But this was in fact the mail that was sent to the printer. The template did have the disclaimer. There were 7 different distinct letters that went to the print shop, and so it's a print shop error and it's a campaign error. I think, in my view, and I think the commission's view historically, is that both the print shop and the campaigns retain the responsibility.
Any other questions or comments for Mr. Tardy?
I don't want to be picky. I just want to understand what's being said, because I'm seeing a couple of different things, and it's probably my eyesight or something. Ms. Bernard said, seems to differentiate between what happened with this letter, saying that the disclaimer did not get added to the Kirby Dowdy letter, and then goes on in full disclosure to say that there was a second letter. And I believe that she's putting that onto the printer. The disclaimer was sent with that mailing to the printer, and the printer. I'm just trying to understand what the facts are, that's all. My understanding was the one that's in front of the commission was not a printer error, it was a campaign error or whatever.
I believe Representative Bernard is prepared to speak to that, Commissioner.
Okay.
Representative Bernard, please feel free.
Okay, I could only hear, I'm sorry, part of what Mr. Tardy had to say. However, I can tell you that the first letter for Kirby Dowdy, which is what we're talking about right now, I know that when we were putting it together, there was every intention of putting a disclaimer on it. I do want to reference what Rommy had to say about my first rodeo, and this is my first rodeo regarding any kind of large mailing or any size mailing at all. I've never done it before. I didn't have to the last time. That's not how the race went. So I've never seen the process of how a mailing would go. And I had several people helping me to do that and get it off to the printers. So I recognize that this is a mistake. There's no question about it. It was unintentional. That was not what we wanted to see happen. There were 7 letters. I wanted to see 7 letters with a disclaimer at the bottom, but obviously if one can happen with the print shop, I would prefer not to point any fingers to the rest of my crew to say somebody left it off of the Kirby Dowdy letter. It should have gone through all of them. I recognize that. And I will take full responsibility, obviously.
Representative Bernard, is my assumption correct that all of the other letters that went out didn't have disclaimers on them?
Did or didn't? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Did, yes.
Thank you. Commissioners have any questions for Representative Bernard or Mr. Garden? Yes, please.
Representative Bernard, I have a loud voice. I'll try to use it. I want to get back to Commissioner Leclerc's question, and I'm not finding it in front of me at the moment, but I believe we have one letter that we were to deal with, and you in a response or a letter to the commission brought up another matter. The second matter was a print shop error, I believe was stated. Do I have that correct? That you're saying it's your / the campaign's responsibility on one matter, the matter before us?
I'm saying that there is no question that there was a print shop error on the second one that I told you about. I'm saying on the first one, I believe we have to take responsibility for that because we can't seem to figure out when did the disclaimer get dropped. Was it before? Was it after it went to the print shop?
Okay.
So.
And I have a follow-up question or two. Is your current campaigning for the House or the Senate?
Am I campaigning for the House or the Senate?
Yes.
I'm campaigning for the Senate.
Okay, thank you. And could you ballpark the general budget for the 7 mailers? What was the general expense for this?
would have to go back to my treasurer on that. I know that there were approximately 13, I want to say between 11 or 13,000 pieces of mail. So whatever that is with envelopes, and that will all be put into the ethics report coming up, or the financial report coming up. It's the stamps, it's the print shop, envelopes. That would probably be it. I'm sorry, I can't come up with a number for you.
No, that's okay. That helps. Thank you, Ms. Commissioner.
When you said 11 to 13,000 mailings, is that divided by 7? I hear you referencing 7 different letters, and this one is approximately.
That's correct. That's correct.
So about 1 to whatever, so then 2,000. Let's go back. 1 to 2,000 letters went out without the disclaimer. Does that sound about right?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I can tell you that each of those 7, like some of the areas, if you're asking this, some of the mailings would be smaller, or some of the distribution, let's say, on one letter would be smaller than another, just because there's more population in one area. Is that what you asked me?
That answers my question, so thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions from commissioners? Yes, please, Commissioner LeClaire.
Yeah. The questions I'm asking here, by the way, are directly coming from the statutory or the rules in how we should analyze violations of this provision. There's a specific consideration the commission can take into account if the error was because of a printer or a paid vendor. My next question is, has anything been done to rectify this error, to inform the people that got the letter that in order to comply with the disclosure requirement?
No.
Is there any plan to do anything like that?
I'd be happy to do whatever the commission thinks I should do.
Well, I'm just reading from the statute. It says one of the things we could take into consideration, if the person who financed the communication or who committed the violation corrects the violation within 10 days after receiving notification of the violation by adding the missing information.
So I can respond to that, Commissioner. What has happened historically is the commission staff functions in a trying to get compliance. A lot of disclaimer issues involve signs, and the commission staff will reach out to the campaign and ask the campaign to rectify it. And oftentimes campaign workers go out and put disclaimer stickers on signs. So that's the remedial action that's in the real trenches that occurs. A mail piece is, once it's out the door, it's out the door.
Other questions from commissioners for Mr. Tardy or Representative Bernard? Sure.
Just to clarify what Mr. Tardy was talking about, March 2021. I think that's in the spreadsheet, but I'm not totally sure what happened.
Yeah, the commission voted to find that these were transportation signs. They were electronic construction signs that were being used. The commission found that they were communications that required the disclaimer, found that a violation had occurred, and then in the subsequent motion voted to assess 0 penalty.
Based on the
Yes, Commissioner Lee made the motion. I think it was seconded by Commissioner Schneider. And the basis for the complete moving it down to 0 was that the campaign had immediately gone out and put a disclaimer sticker on it. So there was the remedial action that Commissioner LeClaire talked about. To be blunt, if you're looking to compare apples to apples, This is very similar to the Hagen Cushing case from 2016.
Yeah, the case with the electronic signs was a case where a third party had donated the use of those signs, and they were sitting around not doing anything. So there was some debate about whether it had any value at all. It resulted in a violation, but no. Other questions from commissioners or anybody? Is there any other evidence that anybody like to present? Okay, we'll close the evidence, and now's the time for commissioners to discuss the case. Anybody have anything they'd like to discuss? Commissioner Leclerc, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I understand Mr. Tardy's experience in this field. Not seeing anything in the law that differentiates the consideration we should be giving to campaign signs versus mailings. And my concern is the statutory requirement is there for a reason, and it's to notify people of who's funding material such as this. It's an important function. I don't think it should be minimized. So when I look at it, I see two ways to go. I mean, it's our job to assure that going down the road that candidates understand and accept and take seriously this requirement. And we have an issue here where it didn't happen. I absolutely accept Ms. Bernard's statement that it was an honest mistake. There wasn't anything intentional. There's nothing here that would indicate it was intentional. They put the notice on their other mailings, except for one, which was, she's saying was a printer error, and I accept that. My concern is, as the commission, how do we get the message out? And one way is to have some sort of remedial action by the candidate to inform the people who were not informed. That hasn't been done. So the other way would be for the commission to make some sort of finding, even with a minimal or no fine that says this was a violation. And that's, I guess, what I would like to say. I think there should be some action either on the part of the candidate or the commission to rectify this in some way, so the public, which is who we serve, is fully notified of where that mailing came from and who paid for the mailing, rather. Thank you.
And I'll just let the commissioners know that it's my intention, I think, to address this issue with two different motions. And the first motion would involve whether or not there was a violation, and the second motion would involve yeah. Any other commentary from commissioners? Ready for the first motion? Okay. I'll make a motion that we find that there was a violation of section 1014, paragraph 1. Second. Any discussion of the motion? Okay. We'll vote it because a couple of us are remote. We'll do a roll call vote. Commissioner Newman?
Yes.
Commissioner Marble? Yes. Commissioner Leclerc?
Yes.
Commissioner Hastings?
Yes.
And I will also vote yes. The next motion is involving a penalty, and I will move that the commission assesses a penalty of $25 for the violation. My thought process is that there are several considerations that we need to make in statute about whether this was an intentional effort to hide the source of the information and the extent of the damage that was done. The statute calls for us to consider, among other things, how widely the communication was disseminated, whether the violation was intentional, whether the violation occurred as a result of an error by a printer or other paid vendor, and whether the communication conceals or misrepresents the identity of the person who financed it. And I think in considering all of those factors, to me, this seems like a very minor violation, and I would recommend a penalty of $25. Is there a second?
I second.
Any discussion amongst commissioners? Yes, Schumer.
This is just a case for me where I agree with the logic and the parameters that you're thinking. I kind of think that $25 is too low. If the mailing went out to approximately 1,500 people, and there's really not a good way to rectify it, because unfortunately, the players trying to get people over action. Trying to keep consistent with findings from 6 years ago in a Senate district, or at least one of the parties. I would think that at least 50, if not 75, would make more sense to me.
Do you want to make a motion to amend?
You're gonna make me a parliamentarian?
Absolutely.
I move to amend the motion to increase the level of fine to $75.
$75.
Yeah.
Can I speak to that?
Please. Well, let's see if there's a second. Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second it.
Okay, Commissioner Leclerc, second. Commissioner,
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I agree with you, consistent is important. The reason I think that 25 is a proper penalty, because I see that we're pushed up against the $200 maximum penalty, and hearing the facts about what happened in 2020, that, you know, an intentional blatant violation. To me, I think it's really important that those be differentiated, and we don't really have that much space in assessing penalty to do that. To me, $75 in the face of, you know, $200 for some people, no, I won't comply, or refuse to do it, which is very egregious behavior, you know, compared to, you know, what really happened here. I think 75 is too large. I think 25 is important. Certainly, candidates taking it seriously here. And I understand what you're saying with respect to the mail, but as I'm understanding of this printer versus not printer error, which I think is important. I understand Representative Bernard to be saying it could be a printer error, but we're not sure, and she's been very cautious to not blame on the printer if it might not be. And so, and I credit that. So that's again why I think that is $25 to be. I think there can be. I want to make sure we have room to really assess behavior on the scale.
Commissioner Goodman made the argument far better than I did. Commissioner Brown.
Just a question. The 200 max, is that coming from recent history, or is that something?
That's in the statute. If you look on paragraph subsection 4, maximum civil penalty of 200.
Okay.
And then I did see that what was said for
Just an observation.
Mr. Chairman? Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Bold does, no, go ahead. Can you speak up? I don't know. Can you hear Mr. Bold?
Just to clarify on the statute, the maximum civil penalty of $200 relates to expenditures for yard signs lacking required information. So it's specific to that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's very important.
Commissioner Leclerc, did you want to?
Well, I was going to point that out, that I believe for this type of case, that what it says is the civil penalty shall be no more than 100% of the amount of the expenditure.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much that was. So.
And that's my mistake. I guess my argument still stands. You know, hearing that somebody intentionally, blatantly refused to comply, and they fined 200, and they think it's 25, and the case is appropriate.
And I think Representative Bernard has been excessive or exceptionally candid in her discussion, her disclosure. So I think that we have recognized that in the final discuss. Any other discussion of the amendment? Okay, the amendment is to assess a fine of $75, and we should have a roll call vote on the amendment. Commissioner Newman.
No.
Commissioner Martin.
Yes.
Commissioner Leclerc.
Yes.
Commissioner Hastings.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Yes.
And I'll vote no. The amendment carries. The motion now is to assess a fine of $75 for the violation. Any discussion of that? Okay, we'll have a roll call vote. Commissioner Newman?
No.
Commissioner Marvel?
Yes.
Commissioner Leclerc?
Yes.
Commissioner Hastings?
Yes.
And I'll vote no. So by a vote of 3-2, we will assess a fine of $75. Thank you all. Thank you, Representative Bernard and Mr. Haines for appearing and helping us through this.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And Chair, thank you. If I may, based on some of the communications I'm getting, the public's having trouble listening and hearing. And in fact, I would make a comment that I think probably Commissioner Hastings probably had trouble hearing the colloquy on the last motion.
Yeah.
And but I mean, for this matter, for the $75 matter, I think you move forward. But for the subsequent matters, you ought to fix the audio.
I think what we'll do is we'll take a break until 10 o'clock, and hopefully our crack staff can figure out how to make this work.
The millennials on duty. Okay.
Then we'll move on to the third matter. This is the complaint against the American Leadership Committee-Maine PAC. And we have Sarah back. Sarah, can you hear us?
Yes,
Excellent.
very clear, very, very clear.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And someone else just joined us. Who are you, sir?
John Burkhan from the Elias Law Group.
Okay, and who are you representing?
We are here for the ALC Maine matter.
And who are you representing?
ALC Maine.
Okay. Ma'am, who are you?
Hi, Emily Hogan, also with the Elias Law Group, also representing ALC Maine.
Okay. And Mr. Hastings, you're back. Can you hear okay?
I'm hearing fine. Thank you.
Tremendous. We called in the millennials and they squared away the problem. All right. So, Jonathan, Mr. Wayne, would you like to tell us about this case?
Sure. This originated through a complaint from Mary Small concerning some mailings that, from her point of view, did not contain the right top 3 funders in the mailing, and then subsequently received a second complaint from Kim Pettengill about the same general issue, but with respect to different communications. And Ms. Pettengill has also shared some digital ads with us today that we've tried to circulate to everybody that may have the same issue too. They're both here today, and I'm not sure to what extent they're coordinating, but I think one or both of them would be pleased to make some comments to you in support of their complaints. And then we have 2 counsel for American Leadership Committee-Maine as well. So the complaint is that initially was that there were some mailings that were reported to our office as independent expenditures, and most independent expenditure communications need to say not just the party who paid for the mailing or the ad, but then also the additional disclosure of the top 3 funders who had provided the largest funding to that party since the last general election. And the statute is specific for the language that should be on the communication, which is the top 3 funders of blank are X, Y, and Z. That's what the statute requires. And instead, on these independent expenditure communications, the disclosure statement said no top donors. So this did not sit well with the complainants, and they filed a complaint about it. I want to thank the counsel for the PAC for responding quickly in order to meet our meeting requirements and also for answering factual questions about the timeliness of the report. Not all council is that responsive, but we really appreciate their cooperation. I don't want to speak for them, but in summary, my understanding is that the PAC was established here in Maine by the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, which is a national organization that is dedicated to electing Democratic candidates to state office. And according to the council's letter, they operate in more than 20 states to promote Democratic candidates. And they have a particular protocol, as they describe it, for complying with all of the financial reporting requirements in the different states, and also requirements like this where communications have to state funders. And what they describe in their letter is that when their PAC makes an expenditure in a state, they have a bookkeeping practice of assigning that expenditure to certain contributions that they have received. And the intent is that if certain contributions that the DLCC has received are assigned to a particular expenditure, say in Wyoming, those same contributors will not be attributed to a different expenditure in California. And that is their system, which they have designed to comply with the different state requirements, which are written differently and sometimes may conflict with each other. So for this particular matter, what they're explaining is that the independent expenditures in Maine were financed through a particular bank account that was set up by the DLCC, which is their low individual account, which refers to individual donors that have given up to $5,000. And that's the source of the money that the DLCC used to transfer funds to the American Leadership Committee-Maine PAC to finance these independent expenditures. So in order, their explanation and their rationale for the no top donors statement is that in order to comply with the requirements in Maine and the requirements in the other states, they attributed the costs of the independent expenditure communications in Maine to specific donors that were all less than 1,000. And because our top fund 3 funder disclosure requirement has a $1,000 threshold, they thought it was acceptable not to actually name donors, these under 1,000 donors, that they were attributing the costs of this mailing. And in my memo, I offer some concerns about that approach, because I think the specific intent of this law was for a PAC or a party committee that's funding an independent expenditure or anyone else to actually name the top 3 funders that had provided them funding since the last general election. And I worry if PACs and parties feel that they have the discretion to assign them to different donors, it gets away from the intent of the law. There's also a timeliness issue relating to the expenditure date. It was in the independent expenditure report, but I might just pause on that. That was not part of the complaints. It was something that we brought up to staff. If you want me to go into it, I can. Or
Sure.
Wait. Okay.
No, I'd like to go.
Okay, so the independent expenditure report was filed on October 14th, and it's in your materials. And you'll bear with me, I just want to have when the independent expenditure report was filed for this set of mailings, it included the expenditure date of October 12th. And the advice that the commission staff gives to PACs and party committees who call us, and sometimes they present themselves with very complicated situations. We're designing things, we're not there yet. There's all sorts of permutations of putting together a mailing. It's not always a straightforward thing as one might expect. Our consistent advice to them, based on the statutory definition of what is an expenditure and our interpretation on our agency rules, is that if they want to strictly comply with the statute, they need to file an independent expenditure report once they have entered into some sort of promise or agreement to pay the vendor for the independent expenditure communication. It's not sufficient, in our advice, to wait to file the independent expenditure report until they actually pay the bill. Once you made the commitment that you're going to pay for it, you have to file the report. We can't verify that that happens all the time, but when asked, that is our advice. So we had questions because we became aware that these mailings, including the Linda Baker mailing, were received by members of the public on Friday, October 14th. And yet the expenditure date in the report was just 2 days earlier, October 12th. We had doubts of whether that expenditure date was the correct date to include in an independent expenditure report. And as I said, Respondents Council have responded to our questions about the timing of how this mailing was put together. And based on their letter, what my understanding is that they were working with a Seattle company, Moxie Media, and there were sub-vendors involved, including, I think, a printing house in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is 50 miles south of Boston. And that templates were sent to the printer on Wednesday, October 5th. And then it's not really clear when the printing actually occurred, and it's not really clear if the templates amounted to an order to have the printing done at that point or not. But it may have been that that's when they directed the printing to happen. But in any case, the printing did happen. And then 3 days later, on Saturday, October 8th, that's when Moxie Media or somebody else or a sub-vendor presented an invoice for the postage. And then the mailings were put into, then they paid the postage invoice on Wednesday, October 12th. And then the mailings were put into the U.S. Postal Service facilities here in Maine on Thursday, October 13th. So the explanation from council is so on Wednesday, October 12th, that is, although they had received an invoice for postage 5 days earlier, that is the date in which they said, we want to move forward with this mailing. And that's when they made the promise or agreement to pay for the mailings. And that is, in their view, what the correct expenditure date is. And we gave them the option of saying, oh, no, it was, please consider whether it was earlier. And they say, no, that is the correct date. And because that's the date when they made the promise to make the payment. And that's when, in fact, they did make the payment. And so that's the issue. We think some of the prior actions that happened before October 12th could be viewed as a promise or an agreement to make a payment. Somebody printed them, somebody directed them to be printed. They got an invoice for a specific amount of postage. But this is a matter of applying a statute to a complex situation of set of circumstances, and we recognize that different people may view this differently. Thank you.
Mr. Bolton, would you like to explain the statutory scheme and the relation between the statute and the regulation that was adopted by the commission in the top three funder issue?
Sure. So there is a with regard to the top three funders, I think the key provision here is subsection E. It's 1014-2-B subsection E, which says, when compiling the list of top funders, an entity making an independent expenditure may disregard any funds that the entity can show were used for purposes unrelated to the candidate mentioned in the communication, on the basis that the funds were either spent in the order received or strictly segregated in other accounts. So that's sort of an exception to the general rule that you have to disclose your, in terms of who the top three funders might be. The funds that are segregated out and are not used can be don't have to be considered. So there are only two circumstances where this comes into play. It's where a situation where the funds are spent in the order received, or they have to be strictly segregated in other accounts. And obviously that strictly is a word of emphasis there. But if funds meet those requirements, they can be disregarded under the statute. So I think that's what's at the core of the issue in this case. And the regulation, I think, just makes clear that that in a situation where you have a PAC that's fully controlled or funded, and this is section 9, 12, E, the regulation. But it just makes clear that where you have a PAC that's fully funded or controlled by another PAC or some other legal entity, that you look past the spending PAC and you look at the PAC that's controlling or funding the spending PAC. So that's how the regulation kind of pulls up. So helpful.
I hope so. Commissioners, anybody have any questions or comments for Mr. Wayne or Mr. Bolton? Commissioner Leclerc.
Yes, for Mr. Wayne, this is a creative interpretation of Maine law. Was any inquiry made to the Maine Ethics Commission about whether this interpretation would have passed muster?
No,
Prior to the
mailings.
Yeah.
I just looked at my colleague and we believe that there was no request for advice on this.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments from commissioners for Mr. Bolton or Mr. Wayne? Ms. Small, Mrs. Pettingill, would you like to actually, if you come up to the witness table and if you care to address us on the basis of your complaint?
Very appreciative to do that. Thank you.
Can everybody hear Ms. Small?
I can use my football voice. Chairman Scheider and members of the Commission on Governmental Ethics and Election Practices, my name is Mary Small and I live in Bath. And I had the privilege of serving as both state legislator and state senator for 24 years, enduring 12 campaign cycles. I filed a complaint with these mailers. I have a couple of them here, not because they were full of lies and deceptions, which they are, but because they omitted the top donors as required by Maine law. I know that PACs are not always truthful in their advocacy. The First Amendment allows this, and there does not seem to be a reasonable solution, at least not one government can impose. However, government can demand to know who paid for the ads, and that may help voters decide whether or not the ads are credible. To that end, Maine law requires a PAC, even a PAC in Washington, D.C., to list their top 3 donors. The American Leadership Committee-Maine wants us to believe that all their donations are under $1,000, so they do not need to list the actual donor, which is the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, a national group with an express purpose of electing Democrats to the legislature. They were the only contributor. They should have been listed as such on the flyers and on the online ads. I don't really care about the top 3 donors. I just think it would have been fair to have on this paid for by the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, because then people will know that there was somebody partisan behind this and not some innocuous group down in Washington, D.C. that seems to care about Maine politics. The Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee were the only contributor, should have been listed on the flyers. The DLCC should also be fully aware of Maine's law requiring this, because House Speaker Fecto is on their board, and he was in the Maine House when the referendum containing the language was before the legislature and then passed by voters on November 3rd, 2015. Now, the argument that all their donors are under $1,000 is clearly subterfuge. An expenditure of $57,000 by the DLCC exceeds the threshold, and no playing around with semantics changes that. The ALC not only neglected to list its donors, it even knowingly printed that it has no top donor on its materials. In its response, ALC said it chose not to list any top donors because it wasn't required to by law, which is in question today. The ALC cannot credit its hundreds of thousands of dollars of independent expenditures to small donors who gave less than $1,000 in an attempt to skirt the top 3 donor requirement. What ALC has done is not consistent with the provisions laid out in the 215th Clean Elections Law or with what has been established in rulemaking. In reviewing the correspondence from ALC's legal counsel, they are adamant that it is common practice to order the design of literature, which then may not be printed. And that speaks to the part Jonathan talked about, the dates. And I did not put that in because I didn't know anything about the dates when I filed my complaint, but I certainly would like to include that now. The practice is a first for me. I would urge the commission to further explore this claim from ALC as it directly relates to tens of thousands of dollars in expenditures and the importance of timely reporting requirements. And I know this commission cannot make them rescind the lives or even prevent the next two mailers from going out, and there are more coming. That is a sad state of politics across the country, but with the newfound understanding of the law's intent, they should be required to include the top donor information on all future mailers and online ads. And as I said, there are others. There's another one that was received that I didn't get. I believe there's one more coming, at least one more. And there are online ads that are appearing daily. The commission should acknowledge that this is indeed a shell game and impose a fine substantial enough to call attention to their skirting the law. Otherwise, we may as well just get rid of that section because left unchecked, there is an unfair advantage to those who feel they are above the law and choose not to follow it. I would also ask that the board act immediately on this because after November 8th, the outcome won't matter, at least not to the candidates who are targeted. And finally, I would like to thank and acknowledge the commission staff for their very thorough work they did researching the actions of the several groups involved. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Small. Any commissioners have questions or comments for Ms. Small? If there's none, thank you for your testimony, Ms. Pettengill. Would you like to
Briefly.
Terrific.
Good morning, Chairman Schneider, members of the commission. My name is Kim Pettengill. I reside in Farmingdale, Maine. No doubt about it, I am a Republican. I have been very active in Republican campaigns for 50 years. And my only concern, and I say it to all of the candidates that I work with, is that we follow the rules and we follow the law. If we do make a mistake, we own up to it. And the rule says that communication paid for by a PAC, full funded, or controlled by another PAC or organization, the disclosure must include those top 3 donors. So therefore, I believe ALC is absolutely required to list the top 3 funders of the Democratic Leadership Campaign Committee as of the day following the general election of 2022. And my candidates that are listed on my complaint, I didn't ask permission to do it. I did put the letter together and I did send them an email on Sunday night telling them that I would be in the commission office on Monday morning in order to file this complaint. And since then, they have sent me various flyers that went out. I was able to give Jonathan some virtual ads that were emailed to me yesterday so that we can see that as well. And it does appear that some of the virtual ads do not have a disclaimer at all.
And thank you. We have a copy of the virtual ads as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any commissioners have questions or comments for Ms. Pettengill? It appears not. Thank you very much for your testimony. Would one of the representatives for ALC Maine like to address us?
We would. Thank you so much. So thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you remind me your name, sir?
Absolutely. Jonathan Burkon, Berkon.
Thank you.
Of course. And thank you, commissioners, for providing an opportunity to speak and present our case on behalf of our client. We also wanted to thank Mr. Wayne, the staff, and including Ms. Burke on the staff as well, with whom we had correspondence this week regarding these matters. We know the commissioner is under a very tight timeline for handling complaints at this time of year, but we really appreciate the thoroughness of the staff's supplemental opinion, the staff's professionalism, as we've all tried to address the complaint over the last week. Also wanted to thank the complainants. I know we're on different sides of the partisan aisle, but I think we do share a commitment to following the rules and having a spirited debate about the issues. And we want to thank them and acknowledge their complaint and their concerns. This complaint deals with some of the more technical aspects of Maine's campaign finance law and reporting obligations. First, how to attribute donors to Maine and non-Maine activities for purposes of Maine's disclaimer rules. And then second, what date an independent expenditure is made for reporting purposes. These are kind of the bookkeeping, reporting, technical issues that Ms. Hogan and I, deal with on a day-to-day basis across many different states. And I will tell you that it is oftentimes difficult to square different states' reporting obligations, particularly when you have to comply with all of them. We could not identify any guidance that was directly on point regarding either of these questions. And in the staff opinion, which we read thoroughly, we did not, it appears that there was not any guidance or prior opinions that the staff flagged as being directly on point either. We followed the protocols here. Our client did that we do in campaigns across the country. We think those protocols comply with Maine statutes and this commission's regulations. And as we said in our letter, if the commission uses this complaint and this process as an opportunity to provide guidance on these questions and disagrees with our interpretation, our client will absolutely follow that guidance going forward and make any necessary amendments. We are here to follow the rules. I think we just have an honest disagreement about what they are. I wanted to start with the donor question and then move on to the reporting question. On the donor question, I know we submitted a lot of paper on this. Digital paper at least, but and you may not have had the time to review everything. So I wanted to just try to narrow the issue to get to the heart of it. I actually want to return to what Ms. Small said in the beginning. Ms. Small's position is that ALC Maine should have disclosed DLCC as the top funder on its communications. That would have provided the most information to Maine voters about who was funding it. We don't disagree with that. If there was no regulation in place and we were just following the statutory guidance, we would have included DLCC as the top donor. And this would have been easy. We wouldn't even be here. Without the regulation that was put in place, this is in section 7, paragraph 12D, I'll read it in a second. ALC Maine would have listed DLCC as its top donor, as Ms. Small says we should have. And we'd be done. There'd be no complaint, end of story. And I also wholeheartedly agree with the staff's point that it's the commission's duty to enforce the statute. And that's particularly the case when the statute's enacted by voters. That duty takes on an even more important meaning. But again, this commission acted in the intervening period after the statute was passed to put in place a regulation. And I will read it here. I think everyone knows it, but just so we're all talking about the same thing. Again, this is in section 7, part 12D. If the communication is funded by a political action committee that is fully funded or controlled by another political action committee or legal entity, the top 3 funders to be listed are the top 3 funders of that entity that fully funds or controls the political action committee. So the solution that Ms. Small would have had us adopt, which is to list the LCC as the top donor, is not an option under the commission's regulations, even though it would have made our lives a heck of a lot easier. And we would have gladly done it. So that's not an option as we read the regulation. We then, and we understand the purpose behind the regulation, right? You didn't want some dark money group, a C4, to raise money from a few big donors, whether it's companies or large individual donors, set up a Maine committee, transfer that undisclosed money to the Maine committee, and then report the C4 rather than those big underlying donors as the donor. But that rule really doesn't apply cleanly here. First off, the DLCC, just to be clear, publicly discloses all of its donors, right? You can find the DLCC's donors by going to the IRS's website and as the commission staff report itself indicated. And the second point is that the DLCC is funded by thousands of donors, the majority of which are folks who contribute $50, $100, $25, $200, something in that range, online or in response to a mail piece. So I think what the commission's regulation was aiming at doesn't apply in a particularly clean way here. So we are struggling then with, we have the statute, we have an intervening regulation that doesn't allow us to do what, if you read the statute by itself, would say we should have done. And so the issue is, can the DLCC use its standard attribution method for allocating these small dollar donors to the states where it spends money? Or must it use a particular accounting method to identify whether an expenditure that was made on October 12th was funded with money given by small donors on, say, October 14th or sorry, August 14th or August 16th, or was it donors who contributed on August 8th, based on a particular methodology that I think the commission staff prefers that we would have used, called the first in, first out methodology, right? That's kind of what this gets down to, right? Do we have the ability to attribute donors using our standard methodology, or do we have to engage in a particular accounting method? That is the narrow accounting issue that is at the heart of this complaint. So if the commission staff is correct, or their opinion is correct, then the DLCC would have to include the names, sorry, the ALC Maine would have to include the names of some individuals giving between $1,000 and $49.99.99, right? The option that Ms. Small wants, which would be to include the DLCC as the top donor, is not an option under the regulation or under the staff commission's interpretation of it. So what we're talking about here is whether we include the names of 3 individuals who none of us in the room presumably even know who these folks are. I don't think any voters know who these 3 folks are. Or do we have some flexibility to use our standard attribution method? I think it's a policy choice for the commission. I think reasonable people could disagree on this. I think you could look at it and say the commission staff is correct. I think you could look at our analysis and say our analysis is correct. The text of the statute talks about strictly segregated accounts. ALC Maine had a strictly segregated account, right? They have an account from which they spend their money. Their donor, the DLCC, has a standard accounting method for determining which donors' funds are used in which states. DLCC moved these funds into ALC Maine's segregated account, and ALC Maine treated those funds that the DLCC attributed as the funds that would be used for this contribution. If the commission were to adopt our interpretation of the rule, they would be in line with other states like Michigan, Minnesota, Washington State, all of which are known for strict campaign finance enforcement, but which provide leeway to committees to determine reasonable accounting methods as long as there's no double counting. That's the key principle, right? You can't double count a particular donor's contribution. That would clearly be gaming the system. But as long as you don't engage in double counting, those states provide for, a reasonable, the use of a reasonable accounting method in order to do that. I'll read you Minnesota's just to give you an example from a comparable state. So on its reporting instructions, Minnesota says, the association may identify specific sources to which it will attribute the contribution to the independent expenditure political committee or fund. A contribution may be attributed to specific donors if the donor has specifically authorized the association to use that donor's dues or donations for independent expenditure purposes, which isn't the case here, right? We don't have earmarked money. Or, absent specific authorization, the association designates specific donors' dues or donations as the source of the contribution to the independent expenditure political committee or fund. And then it goes on to say an amount attributed to a contribution to an independent expenditure political committee or fund may not be attributed to any other contribution to an independent expenditure committee or fund, right? That's the ban on double counting. So that's the rule that Minnesota's adopted on its reporting forms to try to implement what we consider to be essentially a similar rule. And part of our effort at the DLCC and at ALC then in taking the DLCC's money is that we would prefer, it would make for more straightforward and transparent reporting to apply the same protocol across states. That way you don't engage in double counting, right? If we follow a particular rule in one state and a different rule in another state, what that ends up resulting in potentially is that you would be required to end up attributing the same donor to multiple states, which is what we were trying to avoid. So in our view, that is really the heart of it. It is an accounting question about whether we have some leeway in our accounting methods or whether we have to follow a particular path. Before I get onto the reporting dates, I just wanted to pause to see if anyone had questions.
Do any commission members have questions?
Well, how are we gonna separate these out? I mean, I do have questions on this issue. I probably will have them on.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to separate these out.
Yeah, I
to
think that'd
deal with them.
be easier for me. So
Yep.
I do have a few questions if I can.
Please.
So you mentioned, Mr. Bergen, of other states that, you say are similar to Maine that have, I guess, found in favor in a similar way that you describe it. Are there other states that have found differently? Found against your accounting methods, I guess?
I would want to go back and look. I can't think of any right now, but would be happy to, if there's some supplemental time to do more research into that.
And so, and I just want to understand what you're saying about the strictly segregated argument. You're saying that the ALC strictly segregates the money from the DLCC, and that therefore that is in compliance with 1014, whatever it is, 2E. Is that your argument?
It is, if in terms of the statutory language, because as you correctly note, right, the statute assumes that the top three funders will be those of the spending entity. So that's what the statute addresses, right? So that if you look at the statute, you would say, okay, you look at kind of ALC Maine's accounts. The regulation then goes in and basically says that in our case, where you have one funder, you then have to look to the funders. And so the intersection between the regulation and statute there, I think, is what, leaves the commission some room to interpret. But that would be, I think, a reasonable interpretation of what I just laid out.
And then, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I'm just trying to sort of understand them in my own brain. Is part of your argument, therefore, that with respect to the no double counting, that if you were to identify, say, the top three spenders for the DLCC, those three names would be the top three names. Those could be three names in every state, and that therefore that might indicate double counting. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's right. I mean, I think our concern is that if we use the methodology that we normally use, and as a result disclose, say, donors who gave to the DLCC, I'm again just going to pick a date, on August 8th, right? That's when we file our Minnesota report, if we disclose donors who gave on August 8th, because we have the flexibility to choose. And then if in Maine, we essentially have to use this particular methodology where we do a strict accounting, the first dollar in, the first dollar out, in, out, in, out, in, out. If that then lands us on August 8th as the correct date on which those funds were then spent 2 months later for these mailers, we could be in a position where we end up reporting the same donors in Minnesota as we do in Maine because we're using different methodologies. That would be the concern.
That's one more question.
No.
If the commission ultimately were to find not in your favor, what would it look like going forward? Would be your understanding of what it would look like going forward with respect to what you identify and whom you identify?
And so assuming that you adopted the staff opinion or the recommendation, as I understand it, though Mr. Wayne and his colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, that what we would do is do a ledger and look at, okay, this dollar came in and we would attribute it to some expenditure, and we would do that until we hit the main expenditures. And we'd look at the ledger and say, okay, these are the 412 contributions that line up with that expenditure. And we would look to see if of those 412, are there any donors of 1,000 or more? And if there are, we would include those for that particular mailer. And if they're not, we would actually be doing the no top donors as we did here. But I defer if I misunderstood the staff opinion, Mr. Wayne and his team should correct me.
You have a correction to make or explanation?
Should I express that now or?
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, please.
So I think, first of all, the staff and myself, we were reacting very quickly to a response we had yesterday. And this, I was offering some ideas for the commission. It seems to us what the statute calls for is not that complicated of a first in, first out. That accounting method, that's not necessarily the case. what a PAC or a party has to do under the statute is review their contributions that they received for a 2-year period and pick out the top 3. And fortunately, the DLCC has an excellent database, I can tell, and they could make that calculation and figure out who the top 3 were. If they wanted to exclude donors, there are 2 bases for excluding donors. One is that some of those high generous donors actually submitted, gave money to for a separate reason, and their money was put in a separate account. That would be a justifiable reason under the statute to exclude those from the top 3. Or if a PAC or a party committee wanted to exclude donors because that money was spent a long time ago on some other purpose, the statute entitles them to do that. So that it's sort of it's sort of an optional 2 reasons for excluding donors. But if they don't exclude donors for the reasons, they really just have to find the top 3 donors that gave the most in that 21 to 24 month period and put them down. That was what I was suggesting in the memo.
Does that mean that those persons could, and I'm using the word double counting, I don't know that that's technically what I mean, but in other words, right, in Maine, Minnesota, Wisconsin, it could be those same top 3 that aren't excluded names that get repeated. Is that
it could happen that way, that one of the top 3 donors that are listed on a communication in Maine was reported to a different state as being responsible for paying for other communications in other states. That is something that their client wanted to avoid. I don't know if that is such a great concern for the state of Maine. I think the law says what the law says. So if there's double counting, I don't know if I can understand why that's awkward for the client. I don't know if that's a consideration that this commission really needs to put a lot of weight on.
can I ask
Sure.
Sorry. With respect to interpreting the regulation with the statute, does the commission agree that listing DLCC would not be proper?
Yes, I agree with what Mr. Burkhan said on that. It would not, under the way the regulation is written, it wouldn't have been appropriate to say the top funder of American Leadership Committee-Maine is the DLCC. That is a natural, that would have been maybe more informative, but that is sort of ruled out by the way our regulation reads. So
I think that's all I have for now.
And I just want to say, I agree 100% with Mr. Wayne's construction of the statute and the rule. I think it's a lot simpler from the Maine perspective than Mr. Burkhan seems to think. And I think we're responsible for enforcing the law in Maine. It's not our concern what happens in other states or how a response in Maine appears in other states. So I just wanted to say that. Commissioner Marble.
Mr. Burkhan, I apologize if I'm unintentionally kind of going backwards, but I want to ask 2 very straightforward, simple questions. One is, from your perspective, what is the concern if 3 individuals' names arrived in association with political campaigns in 4 different states? The same names are in 5 states. What is the concern?
I think the concern is that it looks like you are then attributing the same donation, the same source of funding to multiple donations. And that to me would be the concern, that we would be accused essentially of double counting. And as a result, that we would be kind of attacked from that end. And so that would be our concern there, particularly when, as I read it, and again, if Mr. Wayne and his team disagrees, here you clearly do have the option essentially of selecting the top funders for a particular ad. And so from an accuracy standpoint, again, if we would obviously follow the rules however they're laid out, but we would not want to leave a public impression that we are somehow utilizing the same source of funds for multiple contributions, because I think that leads to a question of, well, then you're kind of using a funky accounting method that leads to double counting.
Okay, so my follow-up question, is offered in light of trying to represent Maine voters. And it has to do with section 2B of the law and an interpretation when it says a communication that is funded by an entity making an IE as defined in 19B, blah, blah, blah. What I think I'm hearing is it would be inappropriate to list, and I think both our staff and yourself are in agreement on this, to list the national organization as the top, as the entity making the expenditure, because it's not. It's the Maine Leadership Council, and I'm getting the names wrong. I apologize. But a common sense question would go, all right, so if the recorded name of the organization making the expenditure is the Maine named one, but the funder of that entity is the national one, and the top three donors of the national one are John Jones, Sally Smith, and Eddie Halloran. Why isn't that the most appropriate piece of information we could give Maine voters?
Just so I understand what that proposed disclaimer would say, paid for by ALC Maine, funded by the Democratic Legislative Committee, whose top
three donors are.
Yeah, look, if that's the rule that the commission wanted to adopt, we would again follow it. I don't have a particular objection to that as being the rule. I just don't read that as the current rule. I think, as Mr. Wayne laid out, that there was no obligation, or I shouldn't even say obligation. We didn't view it as an option to list the DLCC as a top donor, particularly because there's quotation marks around the language in the statute. So for us then to utilize or come up with our own form of the disclaimer that doesn't match the verbatim language in quotations in the statute, again, leaves us up open to another form of complaint. But we would be open to that, completely open if that's the interpretation. We just don't want to kind of be between a rock and a hard place where we're trying to comply with the strict letter of it, but then we also have to kind of try to take into account, what potentially would inform Maine voters the most. I happen to agree with you and with Ms. Small that the most informative disclaimer would be paid for by ALC Maine, funded by the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee. Like, I would vote for that right now as the prospective rule, because I actually do think that's most informative to Maine voters. And it's easiest for us. So it's actually the best of both worlds. But I think, as Mr. Wayne laid out, that it was not an option. And we worry about utilizing disclaimers where we are kind of calling an audible and changing up the language, particularly where there's verbatim quotations in the statute.
Thank you. Commissioner Marvel. Still looking for help. I'm just wondering, in this instance, if Jonathan and John have any comments on Mr. Burgoyne's most recent statements about your representing what the law says.
I agree with Mr. Burkhan that under the way our regulation reads, it would not have been appropriate for them to put on the mailer, the top funder of American Leadership Committee-Maine PAC is the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee.
Right.
So that wouldn't have been right, because the law says you have to look beyond the DLCC to the top three funders of the DLCC. And that regulation was passed very quickly after the initiative in order to address other kinds of games playing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're an agency and you don't know how everything's going to turn out,
right,
you have certain good government goals, but in other factual circumstances, it can lead to results that might not be as informationally helpful as other options.
But this is something we could possibly address in future wording.
The state of Maine is moving to a system where businesses and nonprofits and unions can set up a separate PAC, but they may not transfer their own corporate funds to that PAC. So there's a sort of a major change in the law that is going to take effect on January 1st. So I think it'd be appropriate to revisit these rules, but they are in effect now. There was a rationale behind them. They are the law, but given how money is going to flow differently in the future, these may need to be looked at.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioners. Commissioner Leclerc. I think you're muted, Commissioner Leclerc.
Okay, sorry for that. The copy I have that was emailed, I unfortunately can't read the actual disclaimer that was on here very clearly. Is there anybody that could just read that out? What is the actual disclaimer?
Can you hold it up, Commissioner Leclerc, which one?
Which one?
Mr. Wade, can you read the disclaimer that's on?
That's the original one.
Yeah. That's this one. Paid for. Right.
It was, it mentioned, Linda Baker is the,
Okay. I'll read it to you, Commissioner Leclerc. It says paid for by American Leadership Committee-Maine, 1225 I Street Northwest, Suite 1250, Washington, DC 2005, period. In capital letters, not paid for or authorized by any candidate, period. In normal letters, no top donors, period.
okay. Thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Hastings.
Yeah, to me, the statute is, whether it makes sense or not, the statute is pretty clear. What should have been disclosed were the names of the top 3 donors to the DLCC. In fact, what was done, and I don't want to say that this is what this was, but you spoke of a funky accounting system, but you devised an accounting system that resulted in segregating only small donors, which allowed you to avoid the disclosure requirement whatsoever. So, I mean, I could look at it as that accounting system was devised for that purpose, to avoid having to disclose names. So it seems to me, I mean, whether it makes sense or not, I think the statute is pretty darn clear that the 3 largest donors of the DLCC should have been disclosed, and that would have just resolved the issue. Whether or not that provided any wonderful information to the Maine voters or not, that would have solved the issue. I don't know why it wasn't done.
And understand your point, Commissioner Hastings. I would just have 2 quick things in response to it. The first is that this accounting system was not devised with respect to Maine in particular. This is something that we have put together to try to comply with laws across multiple jurisdictions. And the second point is that, I think, as I understand Mr. Wayne's and his team's interpretation, certainly what you lay out, listing the top 3 donors to DLCC would have been an option in his view, but there are other options as well because of the provision around segregated accounts and because of the provision for spending in the order received. So the statute does provide several different options, and then as we've laid out, it's the intersection between the commission's regulation and statute that causes the complexity. Otherwise, I agree with you, this would have been fairly straightforward.
Other questions or comments by commissioners? Okay, thank you, Mr. Burkhan. Ms. Hogan, would you like to add anything?
The only other question is whether we want to address the reporting dates issue now, or if there's another.
Sure, why not?
Excellent. So on reporting dates, I think the disagreement that we have between ourselves and, at least as Mr. Wayne laid out, and I do also want to emphasize, Ms. Hogan, and she can speak to this too, had some conversations with Ms. Burke on the commission staff regarding these issues. And I don't know, Emily, if you want to speak to this, but I think it was our impression that at least Ms. Burke thought this was a useful opportunity to resolve some issues that were ambiguous. So Mr. Wayne had invited us to, speak with Ms. Burke and to figure out whether amendments were in order. And it was our understanding that Ms. Burke thought this was actually a useful opportunity for the commission to try to hammer out a rule around this ambiguity, or at least an opinion, which is one of the reasons why we didn't amend. We also think we did it correctly. For us, this reporting issue, we don't disagree with Mr. Wayne that an obligation might trigger a report. Our disagreement, I think, focuses on a narrower issue. Any independent expenditure has essentially two cost components to it. There's the production costs and the distribution costs. And our view, and what we think is at issue here in the heart of the disagreement, is that for purposes of the 2-day reporting rule, must there be an obligation to only have paid production cost, or is the independent expenditure only really obligated or made when there's also an obligation to pay distribution costs? Our view is that there actually has to be production costs and distribution costs for there to be an independent expenditure under the law. And the reason why we picked October 12th was because that was the day where we actually were obligated to pay distribution costs for the ad. So I just want to start with a hypothetical, which I think emphasizes the point. If I design a mailer that asks voters to support Governor Mills or former Governor LePage, and I have that mailer printed, but I never distribute the mailer to voters. It just sits there in my garage, picking up dust with other things. I don't think I've made an independent expenditure under Maine law because I haven't distributed any express advocacy to a single voter. And as a result, I don't have to file a 2-day report because nothing has actually been distributed. And that's the scenario in which I've incurred production costs, right? I've paid someone, I've paid a neighbor, I've paid a professional person to print something, but I've decided not to actually distribute it. I decided not to pay for its distribution. It's just sitting there. So I haven't incurred any distribution costs. Now, if I'm a committee registered with the commission and I use committee funds to pay for those printing costs, even though I don't owe a 2-day report, I completely agree that I still have to disclose that payment to the vendor on my regular filings with the commission, but I don't think I've made an independent expenditure. And I also agree with Mr. Wayne and the staff opinion that if I owe money to the vendor for those printing costs out of committee funds, and I haven't paid those yet before the close of books, then I'd have to report the debt or obligation on my committee's regular filings. So when the staff opinion points to Section 7, Part 3 of the regulations, which is titled Reporting Debts and Unpaid Obligations, that's what I read that regulation to mean. If your committee owes money to a vendor, you have to report that debt or unpaid obligation on your regular filings. But that doesn't tell me if I've made an obligation to make an independent expenditure, which is kind of regulated by a different part of the regulations in Section 10. Again, because we believe that an IE requires both production costs and distribution costs before the expenditure is made. We've offered 2 declarations from our client, both their independent expenditure director and a veteran political consultant, which make clear that periodically a committee will incur production costs for a communication, but choose not to disseminate it. And I also want to offer, I think, another hypothetical with a different medium of communication that illustrates the point even more clearly. This is very, very, very common, right? Like when you produce a TV ad, or if an independent expenditure committee produces a TV ad, it takes a while to get that ad from production to distribution. And typically you shoot a lot of footage that you never use, right? So let's say my client wanted to do some man or woman on the street interviews in May, where they film voters saying that why they're supporting candidate A or opposing candidate B, supporting candidate C, opposing candidate D. And let's say they film 4 of those different videos for 4 different candidates. But then for budget or strategic reasons, they only decide to use one of those videos. And then they execute an agreement to pay $100,000 to distribute it, on the internet on October 12th, right? They've incurred some production costs in May, but they don't know how they're going to use it. Then on October 12th, they decide, hey, I'm going to distribute this video via the internet and I obligate the cost. I would argue that my client would owe an IE report on October 14th, 2 days after October 12th, because they didn't actually obligate to distribute it until that day. But under the commission's position, as I understand it, my client would owe IE reports back in May, even though it had no sense as to whether or not it would actually distribute the ads. I will just say, and I very much take seriously what the commissioner said, that this is Maine law and Maine law governs. But I will say that I have never seen a regulatory agency require a committee to file IE reports solely based on production costs. if there is no obligation for distribution costs. I think that rule, first of all, I'm confident in saying that Maine committees don't follow that rule. I think it would be unworkable, and I think it would be unadministrable. And I'm not sure it would actually provide any more information to Maine voters, because Maine voters would have no idea whether or not these production costs actually led to communications that were being distributed to voters. So I think this is a great opportunity for the commission to make clear that an IE is made for reporting purposes, the 2-day reporting purposes, when there's an obligation to both pay for production costs and distribution costs. I think that will make for clear reporting rules for the regulated community, and the public will still be timely informed of all spending that influences elections, because reporting will be tied very closely to when the communication is actually disseminated. The other factual point I just wanted, in response to Mr. Wayne's presentation, the actual printing for these mailers did not take place until October 10th. The templates were sent on the 5th, but the mailing, the printing actually took place on the 10th.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhan. Mr. Wayne, would you like to kind of detail your analysis?
Yeah, our focus was not on the hypotheticals or the larger policy questions that Mr. Burkhan alluded to. We just felt, looking at this, you've got templates sent to a printer on October 5th. You have an invoicing for postage on 3 days later on August 8th. And then I'm hearing that the print, which I believe that the printing occurred on, I'm sorry, if I said August, I'm in October, October 10th. So it sounds, they haven't really clarified through presenting any additional facts, this idea that we could have pulled this back. This wasn't definite. I think their argument rests on the idea that, yes, we can direct these things to be printed. Yes, they could actually be printed. We could be invoiced for postage, but it's not really definite. And, you know, it's just, to us as the agency that tries to give advice across the board, it feels like the expenditure date being shown here on this report is when they actually paid the bill, not when they entered into the application. And that's why it isn't sitting well with some members of staff. And yes, I think Ms. Burke would appreciate the opportunity for more guidance on it, but this is a very specific example, and I don't know if you want to go there, yeah. So they're saying we made the commitment on the 12th. That's when we said I understand them to be saying that's when we moved forward. That's when we made the promise. But there are all these preparatory steps that, you know, services were delivered, or in a sense, how likely is it that you would go to all, maybe they can speak to this, that you would go to the trouble of having something actually printed and you haven't really made an agreement because, well, you could change, you know, you could hold back some of the districts or hold back some, that's a new one on us.
And
yeah,
isn't it true that in Mr. Burkhan's hypothetical, if they had reported it properly when they incurred the obligation, and they ended up not using it for some reason, they could file an amended report?
Yes, and we often do ask, I mean, when PACs and party committees are unusually cooperative, I mean, or, you know, not unusually, but if they're cooperative, we will say, look, for example, they may not know the final price. We will say, file a report, you've obligated yourself to pay something, give us your best estimate and you can amend it. So there are opportunities to amend it if the actual services cost less than the initial, in a situation where there actually was an agreement, which they're disputing. But, and there was an agreement, but then the actual value of the services and the actual payment is less, they can always amend the report.
Thank you. Ms. Newman.
Yeah, here's where I'm struggling with this, because I look at the statutory language, which is both clear and not clear, as all good statutes are, right? Is made to design, you know, an independent expenditure, 1A, is made to design, produce, or disseminate, right? So I think that's clear. It says design and produce, and it has or, not and. But then it says any communication that expressly advocates for election defeat. So on the one hand, it's clear that an expenditure to design, you know, would be an IE. On the other hand, you know, you're talking about, I do think that this also could be very unworkable, and I worry, again, I'm thinking of what is the most informative to Maine voters. And I actually think Mr. Birkin's hypotheticals were helpful, as well as some of the discussions this morning. So when might they go through all this expense and then not actually distribute? What if it comes back from the printer and there's no proper disclaimer on the bottom? And so and then I think, what's the most helpful information to Maine voters? As again, that information, as Mr. Berkon said, will be in the reports. It's not like it's not going to be, that they spent on the printing, maybe this one had to be tossed, or that in his example, video recordings. That information is going to be made available to the voters, but the IE, I think, is designed for when it's this mailing, this video, this, goes out for everyone to see, then they can know, and then they can know how much it's spent. And I think with a print product, it seems clear, but I think the video is really tricky. What if all those different steps, I mean, that can happen. One can be in May, one can be in April. And I think that we're doing IEs and then amending them. That's more confusing. I think I worry that it is unworkable for the commission, or unworkable for the agencies, and more confusing to ultimately to Maine voters. Because there are so many different steps along the way. And I think this small example shows that. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm struggling with, this language of the statute, which I do think is extremely important ultimately in the end, but also even in that and of itself has some elements of, designed to expressly advocate. Maybe it gets changed along the way and it takes it out, I mean, we've had examples like that. Is this an independent expenditure? No, that doesn't cross the line. Yes, that does cross the line. Even that, has some gray area in it. So to me, it's more confusing than it might seem, I guess.
Yeah, no, I
Appreciate
hear
it.
you, and actually, if I can address his earlier hypotheticals, we do show flexibility. In other words, we as staff accept that whether it's a mailing or whether it's a video, or there are design costs that can be incurred at a stage where they don't know if they're going to distribute it. They don't know whether there are lots of action parties that want to influence multiple legislative races, so they will design a template and they don't know which candidates this is going to relate to. They don't, it's all preparatory. And so we do say that does not need to be reported. We're in agreement on that to an extent. I mean, but once they're at a situation where they think it's highly, I don't know, we don't have an adjective, but even once it's highly probable that they're, they pretty much made the decision to do it, then is it reasonable to expect them to file an expenditure report? And I'm saying that the facts here are contained indicia that seems to us that they intended to move forward with this. But if you want to, so I think that's the sort of.
And would the IE include all of the costs through distribution, or would it be the cost to date, and then after, say, there's additional costs for distribution, would there be another IE? I mean, how does that work? Practically, I guess.
I'm not the one who's giving the advice, and a lot of times it depends on the factual circumstances. What I think would be simplest is after the party PAC or party committee has made the decision to actually, disseminate the communication, it would be most helpful if that report could contain all the costs that went into it, the design, the postage, or the advertising costs.
And the anticipated distribution costs, and then if that's different than actual costs, it gets amended.
We don't, I hear you on the amendments. We don't love the idea that that they're amendments, but that is advice that has sometimes been given out. If people are ready to file a report and willing to, and would like to, just to avoid any kind of implication they're late, but all they have is an estimated cost, and they want to do that, we will tell them to go ahead and do that. But we don't always require that.
But isn't that what would happen, right? If the obligation for the design is what triggers the IE, which I think is what you're saying, and I hear what you're saying, once it's sort of known and probable, they probably might not have the distribution costs.
I think there are a lot of design costs that don't trigger an IE, that there are PACs and parties that want to influence multiple races, and so they incur design costs, and they don't really know how many mailings they're going to do. They may not know which legislative districts, so no reporting requirement is triggered.
But what I'm guessing talking about the ones that do trigger would trigger an IE. Is yours? And I'm asking for a practical aspect, it's to have, time spent on it,
Yeah.
you know, by the time the design is it true that by the time the design is locked in, you know, that it would trigger an IE, you know, your distribution costs, or sometimes that's still an unknown?
I think there has to be a certain amount of definiteness in terms of who are the candidates are going to be affected by this communication, how many are going to be sent out. You have to have some pretty clear idea of what the costs are going to be. And if you don't know which races, you don't know how wide the circulation is, you don't know what the advertising costs are. We need to show some flexibility with the spender to have, you know, reasonable amount of information and sort of a fairly certain intention to proceed with the communication, and then that triggers the. I'm not the one who gives the direct advice.
I'm not trying to put you on the hot seat. I'm really,
Fine.
I hope it doesn't come out there. I'm really just
No.
trying to understand how.
Right. We do offer some flexibility. To folks who are in the middle of this process. My point about this particular communication is the printing was done. The postage was done. Printing began or took place on October 10th. So is it really reasonable to say there was no? Yes, there's a ghost of a chance that they could pull this back, and maybe it was more than a ghost of a chance. Does that not trigger an agreement? We're responding to these particular.
Yeah, you're saying that hypotheticals are great, but this is a case in which there were concrete dates on which obligations were incurred.
I do think that if the commission wants to entertain that this was late, the burden actually is on us to have enough evidence to say that it was
right.
And they are offering an explanation.
Right.
Or this is what our client was thinking. They weren't definite, so I don't know if there is enough evidence here to call this, just to be practical about it, to call this a violation. So, I mean, that is one way of offering guidance, but you have to make sure the evidence is there, and it's sort of up to you how you want to address the situation.
Would you like to have Ms. Burke?
She may
talk about how she interprets these questions. Or?
I'll come up here, so Molly.
Terrific, I appreciate it.
So in these cases, as Jonathan was saying, for design and such, there's a lot of time that the vendor and the purchaser are going back and forth. They're figuring out final details. We don't expect all of that time and these kind of prior, just kind of the basic work on any communication to be recorded in an IE. What we do expect is when there are decisions and movements made where it's like, okay, please print this many these mailers, that triggers, and the guidance that I give, that triggers an IE. In this particular situation, the vendor that actually Moxie Media sub-vendored out to a place called Standard Modern in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Standard Modern did all of the printing as well as all the postage. And when the mailers are printed, they are printed with the postage on them. It's a bulk mailing rate. Bulk mailing rates, from my understanding, and I used to work in the nonprofit world, are based upon a number and also the size of the communication. So to me, is you have a very good idea when you order the printing, what the overall cost between printing and postage is going to be. I do advise people to report estimates on IEs. Right now, and we just entered today as the first day of the 1-day IE reporting period. Of the 2-day IE reports that have come in, I have upwards of 10 a day being amended for this exact situation, that people report what is the agreed upon or estimated price, and then based on the final product that goes out, gets mailed out, is either increased some or decreased some, and they go back and make amendments. I prefer that the public have knowledge about these mailers based on how statute is the earliest instance, how it's written, versus wait until you have the most exact number, because most of the time we're talking about a $50,000 ad buy, it's being changed by no more than 10,000. So really, is the general public being more harmed by the amount changing from 40 to 50,000 than not knowing anything and getting the more accurate number later on? So that has always been my guidance. And I was not asked for guidance in this particular situation before these mailers came out. Otherwise, I would have advised them of that. So that's typically how I give advice, because from my understanding is when you use a mail house or printing like this, if you're using bulk postage, you're not being printed and taking them somewhere else to have a stamp or postage put on. It's being printed with the bulk mailing rate on it. You know the number of pieces you're having printed generally. So you should have a very good idea of cost. So.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. Do commissioners have any questions for Ms. Burke?
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
I had one brief question.
Yes, Commissioner Leclerc.
The reporting schedule is accelerated as we get closer to the election, correct?
Yeah, so today we entered into the 1-day period. So you have to report an independent expenditure within 1 day of entering into an agreement or purchasing a communication that's more than $250 per candidate named or depicted.
Okay. And it's not only just members of the general public that this information is important to. It's the members of the press, and it's also other candidates that are going to have to react. And as we get closer to the election, that becomes more important. Is that correct?
I mean, I think that's the reason why the law is written the way it's written.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hastings.
Thank you. Mr. Perkins raised some interesting points in my mind. When I look at the statute here as to what is an independent expenditure, yes, it says is made to design, produce, and disseminate. That's all there. But the key word to me is any communication. And when does it become a communication? As he points out, a pile of mailers that are sitting in his garage that have never been mailed, I'm not sure, no matter how much they cost, that they qualified, that they became a communication that would meet the definition of an independent expenditure. And I think it's the dissemination of it, the communication of the message that is is what the statute is getting at. It's that dissemination to the public or to whoever it was aimed at, the voter. And until we have both the production and the distribution nailed down, until the two coincide, I'm not sure we've got a communication that can become that could be defined as an independent expenditure. So I'm looking at it that way, and I'm wondering. So that makes it a little bit easier in my mind to come up with a timeline. It's when you really have both prepared it and arranged for and ordered the distribution of it. I think that would trigger the independent expenditure in my mind, and it might simplify things a bit. But I think communication is a key word in that definition, and I'm not sure how we can say something that's sitting on the shelf without dissemination constitutes a communication.
Thank you, Commissioner Hastings. Commissioner Leclerc.
You're muted, Commissioner Leclerc.
You're muted. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Looking at the rules, reporting debts and unpaid obligations, 3A4, a promise or agreement, including an implied one that a payment will be made in exchange for good or service. I mean, I think one of the things that we've addressed in the past, I have a recollection of, I may be wrong, but I mean, what the point is to get information to the public, to other candidates, to the press as quickly as possible about expenditures in a campaign, which gets more important the closer we get to the election day. The rules, this case that we're dealing with today, which is all I choose to talk about at this point, is this case. You had the templates are sent to the printer on October 5th. Was there, and they were actually printed on October 10th. Was there any communication between the 5th and the 10th about giving a final go-ahead? I've heard nothing to that. Maybe there's something there that I haven't heard about. But I mean, what is to prevent? I'm going to put my own hypothetical in here. Somebody's going to dump a major mailing in an important election, you know, in Maine. And so they do print up, 100,000 mailers to send out, and they sit on them. And they say, well, you know, until we pay for the postage, we don't have to report this. I think that is what that rule is designed to address. And a promise or an agreement, including an implied one, will be made in exchange for the good or service. So when this is sent to a printer on October 5th, final form with we would assume, as Ms. Burke said, with the bulk mailing information, there's been a commitment that should be reported at that point. I think that does meet the definition of an expenditure.
So it's a few, if no one else has any questions, just a few points in response.
Well, let me see if Mr. Commissioner Hastings has anything to add.
Not right now.
Okay. Just wanted to put you on the spot.
Thank you.
Any other commissioners have anything? Mr. Wayne? Mr. Burka, go ahead.
Excellent. And I think this discussion has been very helpful at illuminating what I think is our struggle here, which is that everyone has a slightly different view of when an independent expenditure is made. You can have a probabilistic kind of look at it. I think as Mr. Wayne was looking at, when do you get over 50%, 75%, 80%? But that's not really an administrable standard, because that would require a level of investigation and inquiry and interviewing of folks that I just don't think is workable. And to me, and I think as Commissioner Hastings laid out, the most workable standard is when is there an obligation to pay for the communication? We all agree that it's an obligation standard. It's not just a payment standard, but it's what is it for? Is it a piece of the communication, just the production, or for the communication as a whole? And I think that's fundamentally what is at issue here. And I think it's for the communication as a whole. That's a very clear standard. I think, Commissioner Leclerc, to your point, if a group prints out 100,000 mailers and they're going to have to pay for them or obligate to pay for them before they go out. No vendor is going to send them out. And they print them on October 8th. And then on October 13th, they say, okay, it's a go. That's going to be under the 2-day rule. By October 15th, that will be disseminated before they actually even get to most voters' mailboxes. Once we're in the 1-day rule, it'll be within 24 hours. So there's no way that the report will be later than the mailer is actually hitting people's mailboxes, which is what's most important, right? The public deserves to know when the communication has done something to try to influence them. And that would be accomplished under our standard. And it's actually administrable, right? We don't have to worry about when someone's got over 50% or 75%, or whether they're using bulk mailing or not. To Ms. Burke's point, just to point out, she may be right about the bulk mailing, but that's not in evidence. As far as I know, we didn't present that. So I don't know if that's separate investigation she looked at, or is just speaking to her general knowledge, but that's not in evidence here. I will just note that the USPS rules are very different depending on what kind of entity you are. ALC Maine does not enjoy the nonprofit postal permit rate that the Maine Democratic Party or Maine Republican Party does, or that 501c3s or some C4s may get, right? So like every group is under different bulk rates and nonprofit postal rates. Like we need a clear rule that the entire regulated community can follow, and one that doesn't require a look into the probabilistic intent of the committee, and one that says when is there an obligation to pay for the communication as a whole. That's an independent expenditure, I think, is the clearest standard. And to the statutory, I think, point about kind of weighing the clear rule against the statute that I think Commissioner Newman was talking about, what I read that statute to say is that when you are reporting, like once you've triggered the obligation to report, you have to include the production cost as part of the independent expenditure, right? You can't just report the distribution costs, but the question as to when the entire expenditure is made, that to me has to involve an obligation to distribute.
Thank you, Mr. Burkholm. Commissioner Leclerc.
Just one brief question. Again, this was sent to the printer on October 5th and printed on October 10th. Is there any communication between the organization you represent and the printer?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm happy to get it if there's if
There was the invoice for the posted on October 8th in between those dates.
Any other questions from commissioners?
Was there any, excuse me, just briefly, was there any communication between the organization you represent and the printer saying, we're sending this, but we don't really want you to print it. We might change our minds?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, any other questions from commissioners or comments? Okay, we'll close to the evidence unless there's anybody else. Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm one of the candidates affected by.
Yeah, sure.
This deal.
Why don't you come forward and sit at the witness table?
Um,
I'm sorry, I would have called on you earlier.
I was just waiting until everybody had their chance to speak, including the complaining parties directly. My name is William Clardy. I'm running for the state legislature, and I'm one of the dozens listed in Ms. Pettingale's complaint. And I would like to offer a couple of points from a candidate's perspective, including advice that I've received from Ms. Berg and my understanding of how the Ethics Commission advises people. And my first and foremost observation is that there is not an unlimited universe of states. The DLCC chose to step into Maine and 19 other states. They did so without asking what the rules were. It's my understanding. They went and decided to come in and jump big. They didn't just send out one mailer. They sent out mailers opposing several dozen candidates, supporting several dozen candidates. So when they sent this precise invoice, when they sent that precise invoice, it was part of an overall strategy. I would say that strategy establishes that they had estimates of what costs would be, what their planned schedule was. This was not I woke up October 8th and said, yeah, go ahead, send it. So questions about exact timing on when the expenditure had been reported. Okay, if they only made the final decision on the 12th or the 10th, then 48 hours after that, the exact amount should have been reported. But when did they report that they made the decision to spend the money? When did they get an estimate from the printer? When did they get an estimate for the several dozen mailings they reported in that independent expenditure report? That to me is a key question as to intent. A second point, and this is where I respectfully disagree with Mr. Wayne. The statute says one thing about reporting top donor. The regulation says something slightly different that gives just enough wiggle room. But if we accept the slightly different literal interpretation of the regulation, there are scores of mailers out there sitting in mailboxes right now that go by the common sense, Planned Parenthood PAC, funded by Planned Parenthood. Not donors of Planned Parenthood, but Planned Parenthood, to use one example. So it is a little bit disingenuous in my view to say, well, yeah, we should ignore the law. We should look at the regulation and give a handoff saying you looked at the regulation and therefore, you had no identifiable top donor, which comes to my third point of, they didn't say they had donors that they didn't need to report. They said, no top donor. Their exact words. That's different from saying, you know, I only rob people of $5 a piece, or, you know, overcharge $5 a customer, versus I didn't overcharge anybody. They said no top donor. That's a clear misstatement. And last point I wanted to make is, speaking as a candidate, I don't know if the requirements are closely the same for PACs, but I would assume they are. Yes, when I get an estimate, or when I make a decision to spend money, I have to report that's the date that I made the decision. I made the agreement. These folks used an example of, you know, they might have to report an estimate back in May. Well, guess what? On my filing right now, there's a $500 estimate in May from when I ordered some signs that the vendor still hasn't given me an invoice for. So I haven't paid for it yet. But it's still there on my report, because that's when I decided to get the signs. And when I get the exact dollar amount, I will amend it, as per the advice I could get from Ms. Burt and the other commission staff. So, you know, it's breaking it down into trying to over account it, overthink it. If we just apply some common sense. And also, as I forget which one of you was said, this is Maine. If you come playing Maine politics, you play by Maine rules, not Minnesota rules, not DC rules. And if you don't want to ask what the rules are, then you play so at your own peril. And if you have doubts about what the rules are, you can ask the folks who are going to be deciding, because administrative law isn't quite as fixed and rigid and all as statutory law. So rules of evidence are a little bit more flexible. And if you have an email saying, yeah, this is how you should report it, that gives you some cover for, yeah, I asked, this is what they said, I followed that to the best of my ability. They didn't ask. They jumped in several $100,000, several dozen mailers, not only opposing candidates, but also supporting candidates, which I suspect also lack any disclaimer or a proper source of funding for who funded those mailers. So it's just, this isn't one mailer, little technical problem on accounting. This is a pattern of behavior, coming in late, lots of money, lots of mailers, and trying to dodge being held accountable is how I see it.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Would any commissioners have questions? Okay, thank you very much. I think the best way to handle this is to break it down into a couple parts, like we kind of talked about at the very beginning. So I will make a motion that we find that ALS or ALC, ALC Maine PAC has violated section 1014, paragraph 2B, and the Maine Commission Regulation, section 7, paragraph, or section 7, paren 12 of the Commission's Chapter 1 rules, paragraph D. And is there a second?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded that we find that ALC Maine has violated section 1014 and those paragraphs in the commission rules. So now it's time for conversation and debate and consideration of the question. To me, I agree 100% with Commissioner Hastings. It seems very clear to me that in Maine statute, there's a rule or there's a provision that requires disclosure of the top 3 funders. And then the next step in that analysis is if the communication is funded by a political action committee that's fully funded or controlled by another political action committee or legal entity, The top 3 funders are to be listed are the top 3 funders of that entity that fully funds or controls the political action committee. And, you know, we can debate about whether that's the most useful information or not, but I think the requirement is very clear that in this case, the ALC Maine was fully funded by a national organization, and they should have disclosed the top 3 funders of that national organization. There's one paragraph that would have exempted 2 categories of funds from disclosure, and I don't think that paragraph applies here. Any other thoughts? Oh, Commissioner Leclerc, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with you. And I think, you know, maybe there's some way of having it be even more useful, but it does provide useful information, even if you just put names of people, to put names of people on the mailers. That allows the press to go out and do its job of who is funding this, and report it to the public. So it may not be, you know, optimum, but it is useful information, and therefore I'm going to support your motion.
Thank you. Other thoughts, comments? Okay, we're ready for a vote then. And again, since we're partly remote, we'll do it by roll call. Commissioner Newman?
Yes.
Commissioner Marble? Yes. Commissioner Leclerc?
Yes.
Commissioner Hastings?
Yes.
And I will also vote yes. Before we go to the next motion, Mr. Bolton, I just want to confirm that the paragraph, section 1014, paragraph 4 on enforcement, is that the mechanism that we're referring to for enforcement of this violation?
I believe that's right. Just yes. So it's subsection 4.
Okay, and Mr. Wayne, do you know what the amount of the expenditure in violation was?
Well, the scope of the mailings that have been complained about has been increasing, and it's not always clear from the IE reports, you know, what costs go with what mailings. If you'll bear with me, I just want to, I did list all the independent expenditure. On page 5 of the staff memo, I listed the different independent expenditure reports that we've received. So first independent expenditure report related to some social media and online advertising costs. The second IE report is the one that triggered Mary Small's complaint. That was in the amount of $18,146. But then 5 days later, there was another IE report relating to direct mail in the amount of $38,497. And then there was others. So, I mean, you might want to hear from council, but I mean, my reading of this is that there are a series of mailings that all say no top donors. I have partial information, but that's my impression. So the first complaint related to an $18,000 expenditure, but then the very same violation may have occurred due to the $38,497 expenditure, and that might have been part of what Ms. Pettengill provided to us. It's hard to match up the particular cost. So my understanding is that no donors have been named on any of these advertisements or mailings, but council can correct that if that's mistaken.
Is that true, Mr. Burkhan? And you're muted right now.
Yes, that is my understanding as well. We can obviously get confirmation on that point, but that is my understanding as well, given that we were applying the same methodology. I will note, as we indicated in the letter and in the beginning, that now that the commission has spoken about this. To the extent that any future mailers go out, we will of course comply with the commission's interpretation here. So I do want to get clarity on that so that there is compliance going forward. So I don't know procedurally where we can ask for that, or if that's appropriate here, or if that's something we should follow up with Mr. Wayne about and his team.
That's exactly what I'd suggest. I'd suggest contacting Mr. Wayne, and he'll set you straight.
Excellent. And then, obviously the second point, we, again, given, I know the last sentence of paragraph 4, talks about the entity that has committed a violation, correcting the violation within 10 days after receiving notification. Obviously, with respect to mailers that have gone out, I'm open to suggestions as to how that might happen, but certainly going forward, we will follow the advice that Mr. Wayne gives. And, I hope the commission takes that into account in assessing a penalty, in addition to, I think, the fact that this is, to our knowledge, a case of first impression before the commission.
And I think your comments are well taken, Mr. Burkott. I think from my perspective, maybe we ought to wait and impose a penalty if we're going to impose a penalty after some more investigation. I think.
Could I make a
Oh,
motion?
please.
I would like to make a motion that the commission not impose a penalty. We found a violation. And I think but I think that all the evidence presented makes it clear that to me, this was although wrongly, we ultimately decided wrong interpretation. It was a valid interpretation based on some other statutory language. I think it's clear from Mr. Burkon that the party's going to correct the assessments going forward. They're certainly going to incur fees and changing their mailers as they should. But I think in this instance, based on the confusion and with respect to the statute and the regulation, that no penalty be assessed. So I'm going to make that motion.
Is there a second? Seems that there's no second, so that motion fails for lack of second. I'll make a motion that we defer consideration of a penalty until the next meeting, and that we give Mr. Wayne and the staff a chance to investigate some of the factors that play into what the enforcement ought to consist of. Is there a second to that?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Discussion? Yes.
Just questions out loud. So some of those factors would include number of mailers, scope of mailers, general estimated budget at least.
Exactly.
Actions the representatives may take in the meantime. My only concern with that, and I'm not going to be able to express it clearly because it's not a clear thought, is that we're so close to elections with so many mailers having gone out that, at least for now, there won't be any general ripple of consequence that anyone determines or sees. It's a concern, but I don't know how to address that as reasonably and accurately as your motion. So I'll be supporting the motion.
Thank you. And your comments are also well taken. In an ideal world, it would be nice to make the complete statement now before the election takes place, but I think we really need some more information before we can make a solid decision on enforcement. Any other thoughts?
Could you repeat your motion, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, my motion was to defer until the next commission meeting an action on enforcement of the violation that we just found, and to give Mr. Wayne an opportunity to do some investigation into the factors that play into the enforcement decision.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, we'll take a roll call vote, Commissioner. Commissioner Newman.
Yeah.
Commissioner Marble, yes. Commissioner Leclerc,
Yes.
Commissioner Hastings,
Yes.
and I will also vote yes. thank you all for coming. Thank you for the significant amount of information that you all presented and brought to our attention. I think it allowed us to consider an important question going forward and with this party. Yeah.
Okay.
We still have questions to deal with. And we still have the question of the timing of the reporting to deal with. And from my perspective, I'm not sure we have enough information on that question to make a firm decision. I don't know if other people agree or not.
What information do you think we were lacking?
I think we would need to know some of the details that went into kind of sending the message to the printer to print the mailers, kind of what information went between the PAC and the printer in order to get this ball rolling, and whether it meets the statute. I'm not entirely 100% clear on that right now.
I'm not 100% clear either, but it's unrealistic to me in my world, if we're talking about the 2-day notice, to kind of look back in time and say, well, it went out on the 14th, just to throw that date out, and ergo, the decision wasn't made to the 12th. I think, as Jonathan has talked about, information directing this action started arriving at a printer around the 8th, if I have the date right.
5th, I think.
5th.
Went out on the 5th.
Yeah.
And it certainly appears justified that information included accommodations for the bulk rate to be expended and printed on the mailer as part of that communication. So to me, no, I don't know every detail, and there's probably information that would be helpful, but it seems pretty clear to me that this was an action under the IE regs that did occur earlier than they're accounting for. And I think there's a violation.
Other thoughts? Yeah,
Yeah.
Commissioner Claire.
I mean, I'm just going to read the statute. An independent expenditure is under 1019B1A is made to design, produce or disseminate any communication. So design or produce any communication. They're independent. And I believe Mr. Birkin made the example in response to my question that if somebody produced $100,000 in brochures and then decided to sit on them, that would still be an expenditure. I believe that's what he said. And that would need to be reported. And then you go to the rules under section 7(3)(a)(4), the following constitutes an expenditure, even if the payment for a good or service has not been made at the time of the event. And 4 is a promise or an agreement, including an implied one, that a payment will be made. And I mean, this is an administrative hearing. The evidence to me that I rely on is that the material went to the printer on October 5th. It was printed on October 10th. There is, in response to questions about were there any communications, that said, take this, Mr. Printer, but don't do anything with it until we get back to you. I haven't heard any evidence like that. And we're entitled to make draw reasonable conclusions from evidence that is before us. And the respondent here has had the opportunity to put that forward. So I agree with Commissioner Marvel.
And I can be convinced. Commissioner Hastings, did you raise your hand?
No, but I'll say something anyhow.
Sorry, I keep putting you on the spot. I apologize.
Well, you do, so I gotta respond. No, I still go back to I don't believe that Mr. Birkin did say that printing 100,000 brochures and putting them in his garage would be an independent expenditure.
Correct.
We can confirm, I think he's confirming that.
Yep.
I think what he said was that it took both the production and the distribution to come together to make it what I think of. It has to be a communication before it can qualify, before the cost of that communication becomes an independent expenditure. The fact that you spent money in the production of something that is never disseminated, I don't think is an independent expenditure. The purpose of the statute is to inform the public about expenditures made of communications actually disseminated to voters. That's the action that we're trying to regulate here. And so it's still murky as to what is the actual date. I'm not sure that holding an invoice and not paying it for 4 or 5 days, if you should have that flexibility. Once the postage is ordered and you got the invoice for it, I'm thinking, to me, you've now made a commitment. This whole subject is a very murky area, and I suspect that throughout all campaigns, there are all kinds of different ways of handling that date. We just don't know about them because complaints aren't made. But I'm not sure that this group could hold that postage bill until the 12th or whenever it was and decide, well, that's when we've actually done it. We ordered up the invoice some time ago. I think that's when they made the commitment to send the communication out. And I'm not willing to make a decision on it right now, but that's the way I'm thinking.
Commissioner Leclerc.
I just have to keep going back to the statute 1019B1A. Seems maybe I'm missing something. It won't be the first time. Is made, an independent expenditure is made to design, produce, or disseminate. So to me, someone could put a lot of money into designing and producing a brochure, and they'd have to report that part. And then if they held on to it for 3 months, when they mailed it, they'd have to report that part. I don't think it's confusing. I think it's very clear. Is made to design, produce, or disseminate. That's how I read it.
Commissioner Hastings.
Well, I understand, in Commissioner Leclerc, to me, the key word is communication. To design or produce something, when did it become a communication? When it was produced or when it was disseminated? I don't think it became a communication until the decision was made to disseminate it. So that's why I think the production costs of TV ads or brochures that sit on the shelf are not yet communications. And if I would think, I guess I look at it this way, if these mailers had never been sent, even if we learned about that they were produced and put on the shelf but never sent out, would we be holding a hearing today? Would there be a possible violation? I think you're saying that would be a violation of the statute, even though they were never sent out to anybody and nobody ever saw them. I think that it has to become a communication before the expenses going into it become independent expenditures.
I think we'll have to disagree on that. And I have to go back to this specific case where they went to the printer on the 5th, and we have no evidence in front of the commission right now that that was anything but an intent, a firm commitment that resulted in an obligation for them to report.
I just want to add that I agree with I understand what Mr. Commissioner Hastings is saying, but I fear that his interpretation of the statute would render the words design and produce irrelevant. And I don't think that that's a proper interpretation of the statute. So
Can I just offer a point in response to that, the statutory interpretation point, or? No,
Well, this is really time for us to
understood.
thank you, though. Any other thoughts from commissioners? Okay, I'm sensing a wave here. And I will respond to that. I'd like to make a motion that we find that ALC Maine violated section 1019B, paragraph 4, that it required a report of an independent expenditure. And is there a second? Second. Any further discussion? Okay, we'll take a roll call vote. Commissioner Newman?
I'll say yes. I'll say yes.
Commissioner Marble? Yes. Commissioner Leclerc?
Yes.
Commissioner Hastings?
Yes.
And I will also vote yes. So it's 5-0. The next question is, my next question is where do we find the enforcement mechanism for this violation? So I'm just
It's 1020,
1020.
well, 1020A, okay. It's, independent expenditures are under what, like candidate campaign finance.
I don't think we have a copy of 1020.
No, we didn't anticipate you need it. But this is the provision of law that relates to late reports by candidates and by parties and by independent expenditure. And
Based on a percentage of the.
yeah, I mean, the typical thing is there's a preliminary penalty is calculated and then the party gets the chance to ask for a waiver. So I don't know how many of you want to make a penalty determination today, but I just have to point out, we haven't really invited comments from the respondents on
the penalty.
Yeah, on the penalty, whether, we asked for factual information relevant to whether or not the expenditure date was correct, and that applies whether the report was correct, but this was done in a compressed time period, and we haven't, I think they deserve an opportunity to look at the statute as a whole and look at the late penalty provisions and offer whatever kinds of comments that they would like to make. I mean, that's my personal point of view. So
I think that's entirely reasonable. I would move then that we defer consideration of the enforcement action until the next meeting. Second. Any discussion? Okay, we'll call a roll call. Commissioner Newman?
Yes.
Commissioner Marble? Yes. Commissioner Leclerc?
Yes.
Commissioner Hastings?
Yes.
And I will also vote yes. And now I'd like to thank everybody for your generous participation in this effort. I think we considered some very important questions, and I think we hopefully will have provided some guidance for campaigns in the future. So thank you very much. Thank you to the attorneys for coming and helping. And yes.
So there really isn't any need from your point of view to ask for any evidence relating to when did the agreement happen? When did the promise happen?
Correct.
Was it late or not? It's really going to be focused only on the penalty.
That's right.
Okay. All right.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question. Any chance we can take 5? We can. Let's take 5. Actually, we'll take a little bit less than 5. We'll take 4. Okay. Now, Jonathan, this last item, the proposed rulemaking, that's just for our information. We don't have to do anything with that right now, right?
Well, actually, I think we need to approve the idea of moving forward with rulemaking.
Okay. Good. Now go do everything.
And fix everything we covered under the last agenda. Right. So there's no more ambiguity anywhere ever, and no judgment.
Thank you, Dennis.
That's right.
Think of that before.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Everything clear to everybody.
There are no campaign finance law.
Oh, wow. Wow. How's that going? All right, we're bringing people back in. Commissioner Leclerc, Commissioner Hastings, can you hear and see?
Yes.
Yes.
Terrific. There's another person I don't recognize. Sir, who are you?
You're muted, sir.
There we go. I'm here. Can you hear me? Joseph Vanderhulst, representing Maine Families First.
Would you please spell your last name?
I figured you would ask that.
You've probably been asked that before.
It's a doozy. It's Vanderhulst, Sierra Tango at the end.
Terrific. Oh, you even know the phonetic alphabet.
Well, you kind of have to when you have a name like mine.
Excellent. All right, we'll move on to agenda item 4. And Mr. Wayne, would you like to give us some background?
Sure, this is a complaint by Ms. Sarah Sally against the Maine Families First PAC, and it relates to the contribution reporting by the PAC. The PAC filed a campaign finance report just after the end of September, which was a quarterly report, and it the totals in the report indicated that the PAC had received $100,000 and had spent $100,000, and our e-filing system calculates a cash balance based on that data, which would seem to indicate that there was $0 left, cash on hand in the PAC. And what Ms. Sally is noticing is that 5 days later, according to a subsequent independent expenditure report, the PAC made an expenditure of $999,245 on television advertising to oppose Governor Janet T. Mills. And Ms. Sally is here today to express her concerns, but what I take her point to be is that informally, television advertisements don't happen overnight. They take planning. It takes some expectation that money is going to be available. And she notes that the definition of what is a contribution includes not just cash received, but also a promise or an agreement expressed or implied to make a contribution. And so what she is questioning is, again, I may be misstating her concerns, but that should this PAC at some point, particularly maybe in the report covering September 30th, have reported a promised contribution. And so that's, or possibly even a received contribution. So we turn to the PAC for response, factual response, which we received. We first looked at it yesterday when we got to the office. And what the PAC is confirming is that the contributor who donated the $100,000 is Mr. Thomas Klingenstein. I'm saying that right. He provided that the PAC received $999,245 on October 3rd. But Mr. Klingenstein had not made promise or pledged funds to the PAC prior to October 1st. That's the factual response. And so this matter is before you to decide whether there's evidence of a violation, whether you want to seek additional information, whether you want to take no action.
Sure, thank you.
Before we talk, I don't seem to have in front of me, I know it was emailed, the printed
Version of the
sort of
response.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have that? Can you have it?
Yeah,
I have the original.
I think that's
Just not.
this is the newest from this point.
Stop. Thank you. Sorry.
Does anybody have questions for Mr. Wayne? questions, comments? Okay, Ms. Sally, would you like to come forward and tell us about the complaint?
Good morning or afternoon.
Go ahead, rub it in.
Thank you, commissioners, for hearing this complaint, especially at the end of a long morning. I think all the facts that, as and my understanding of what happened, and my concerns are expressed in the letter. But I just wanted to briefly highlight a couple of issues. We can all agree this is a really important election that gets said about every election, and it is true. And the expenditures in this case is an enormous amount of money, particularly in the context of Maine politics. It's clearly seeking to influence this crucial election, and it was made at a critical time in the election cycle. But the reporting was made in a way that prevents the public from knowing where the funding came from for several weeks until just days before the election. So that timeline is what raises the red flags. It defies logic that without any pledge or commitment of funds before October 1, that the PAC secured and paid a vendor essentially $1 million on October 5th, for an ad that was created and aired immediately after that. It seems very unlikely they'd manage to do this if they didn't know the money was coming. This PAC is obviously a sophisticated organization with experienced players. And in its the short time frame that the Maine PAC was in existence or registered with Maine, there was another expenditure that was reported with the funding was reported in a similar way, so that it wasn't immediate, it was reported at the same time. So I feel that these circumstances warrant at least further investigation if you can't find a violation based on these facts and what you'll hear today. I would ask for further investigation to prevent entities from playing games with our system in order to conceal funding sources for expenditures, particularly as large and influential as this could be. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have questions or comments for Ms. Sally? Just, I hope you find this appropriate. I'm just curious. Do you have experience in holding office or helping run campaigns or some connection with Maine politics?
Yes. My experience is kind of grassroots. I'm chair of the Waldo County Democrats.
Okay.
And I have been for a few years, but
Had you
no
been in front of us
experience.
before? Yes.
Last
Yes.
month, very different context. I did not expect to ever be back here again. Nothing personal, but I didn't anticipate this, but this came to my attention, and having seen the commission's commitment to its mission, I felt it was a worthwhile complaint to make. So that's why I'm back.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much. We can hear from Mr. Vanderhulst.
Thank you, sir. Can everybody hear me okay?
You're kind of breaking up a little. Can you speak a little louder?
Let me see if I can't.
That's better.
That's better.
That's better.
Okay, I just need to lean in. I don't know if there's a separate volume for my mic. It doesn't look like it. Let me just turn it up in general. Okay, there we go. Thank you, everyone.
for the opportunity to obviously to appear and be heard on this complaint. It's been quite a few years since I've spoken in front of the commission before. Not sure who is still on it from back then. Unfortunately, I'm not able to come out there and visit in person, though the times I have been out there have been really nice. Maine is a really nice state to visit. I just wanted to, I guess, first of all, say that this is ahead of lunchtime, hopefully a very simple and straightforward agenda item, especially in contrast to the immediately preceding one. I was hoping to say good morning, but as we found out, it's now good afternoon, which is fine. So hopefully we can crank through this pretty simply. According to commission rules, the complaint needs to show sufficient evidence or sufficient grounds for believing a violation has occurred. And in our opinion, the complaint really just doesn't show kind of any grounds that there's been a violation. The committee set itself up, established itself, and registered. All expenditures have been reported in a timely manner, and all contributions received have been reported in a timely manner according to the main schedule. And I would say that the complainant's issue is more with the schedule, under the statute and under law, than really with anything that we've done. In terms of anything not being disclosed, the donor was disclosed in previous reports. Again, the affiliated entity, the national affiliated entity, was disclosed on the registration, and the donor was disclosed in the ads. An individual was disclosed in the ads, again in stark contrast with the previous agenda item. There's no gymnastics. There's no intermediary entities. It's just a very simple PAC was set up, received donations, and has made expenditures. Now, it's true that, and again, the issue is with, if the complainant takes issue with Maine law, the independent expenditure reports, like the 48-hour and 24-hour reports, now that we're in that period, don't require like real-time disclosure of contributions. It's on a schedule. So there's a Q3 report, then a pre-election report, and they have close of books and coverage periods. So that's when things get disclosed. And it just so happens that the 24-hour reporting period in Maine starts now. For example, under federal law, it's 21 days. In other states, they have increased cadences for how that works. But here, just everything has been disclosed according to the schedule. And that's pretty much, yeah. I guess the real curious thing to me is, and why I was a little bit surprised by the complaint, is that, again, in contrast with the previous agenda item, I mean, the donor has been disclosed and is on the ads. So I really don't really see what the issue is. That's about all that we have.
Thank you. Any commissioners have questions for Mr. Vanderhulst? Yes, Commissioner Martin.
Just out of curiosity, according to the complaint, statements show that the PAC had received a single contribution for $100,000 prior to September 30th, but had zero cash on hand. Is that information accurate? And if so, what was that expenditure on?
As far as I know, that was accurate, and that expenditure was reported on the previous report. It was an independent expenditure. That's all on the Q3 report.
So I apologize. Some of this is all coming last minute, and I don't want to put staff under the gun either. But
yes,
Do we
And
have any information on that as reported?
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry, the report was, a report was filed.
Yeah.
Let me just see if I had, that particular report was not included in the materials.
Right.
Let me see if I have at least have the date in the materials. I guess I don't. So a report was filed that indicated $100,000 was received from Mr. Klingenstein, and there was an appropriate, I mean, there was an expenditure that on its face looked compliance. I can't remember whether it was for research or polling or what it was, but there was a report that indicated.
Okay.
And the way our report, that was earlier than the October quarterly report.
Right.
So so the way our reporting system works, there's sort of a running total. So when the report that ended on September 30th was filed, it showed there was a previous expenditure earlier in the year for $100,000. There was a contribution was received, an expenditure was made, and then our report calculates that there's the cash balance of the PAC is zero. We don't actually know what was in the pertinent bank account, but that is a calculated, something that's calculated by the bank system. So there was a previous report.
And I
Okay,
will,
actually, John brought it up. I think this is right. Do you want to know more details about that earlier report, or you
Just
trying-
a sense of it.
Do you mind scrolling down?
Miss Sally, do you want to?
I think I recall it might have been digital advertising. It wasn't for TV.
Oh, it's the earlier, yeah, it's the report
I
before
have
that.
it.
It's September.
I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah, sure. Ms. Burke's prepared to give us some more
Ms. Burke.
details.
So it was $100,000 expenditure on September 8th to Logan Circle Group for digital video ads and peer-to-peer text messaging was tagged as payment to oppose Janet's emails.
Thank you.
Sounds correct to me.
And again, I'm just trying to get my own head straight.
I'm sorry.
When did the 499 grand first show up, and when did the TV ad run?
It was 900.
Well, I want
Thank
to
you.
clarify the affidavit. Well, there's two things that I think there might be some just misreading of. The affidavit says that no, had Thomas Klingenstein, he hadn't promised or pledged funds before October 1st, but he had given funds, obviously. I mean, that was reported that he had given funds.
Okay.
So I think I saw somewhere in the commission materials where, somebody had said something like, we said that he hadn't promised or pledged funds, and yet he gave funds. Well, he gave funds. We're talking about promise or pledge. And then on the second item, I don't actually have it in front of me, but the funds were received. The funds for the TV ad were received on October 3rd. I don't know, and I very much doubt that it was $999,245 on the nose. That'll be on Friday's report, what that exact figure was.
And when did the TV ad start running?
When did they actually run? I think they ran later because that I don't know off the top of my head, but they would have run subsequent to when we filed the IE report, because it's triggered by the expenditure and not by dissemination. I actually don't know that date.
No, go ahead, Mr. Wayne.
What we do know is that on October 7th, the PAC filed an independent expenditure report. They reported the $999,000 expenditure. They reported it with an expenditure date of October 5th.
Right.
But we're not privy, we don't know when the ads.
Yeah, I'm not
running.
sure. Yeah.
And I don't know whether Miss Sally knows, but she's pointed us to a video link to a link to the ads, but I don't know when they ran.
I'm not sure it matters when they actually ran.
No, it shouldn't.
Miss Sally?
The video that I saw was dated October 7th. So it was available somehow October 7th. I don't know where that copy came from.
Okay, I don't know if it matters or not. What I'm struggling with is not unlike part of the discussion of the last matter. Because you've got to know and be planning well in advance of October 7th or 5th or 3rd. An ad that you're going to spend, am I getting the right numbers, $1 million on. Which gets back to what is the nature of an IE and when does it need to be reported?
Two questions for Mr. Vanderhoff.
Now I'm confessing, I'm just struggling with it. That's-
And I just have some more questions on the dates and you can feel free to say, don't worry about this, but you just mentioned September 8th on the previous expenditure, but I see that it didn't register as a PAC until September 9th.
So how it works is.
That's, yeah.
The PAC has a week, once they initially register with us, they have a week to file their initial report. Once their initial report is filed, then they're fully accepted as a fully registered committee. So I have to look at the actual timestamp, but that was the day after they filed. The 100,000 was on their initial report.
But I agree with your, I guess, question, which might be for Mr. Wayne. The timing seems off, and it seems like on the previous issue, somebody brought a different issue to the commission, and the commission noted that the timing may be off and looked further into it. And I guess I'm wondering why that didn't happen in this case, or maybe it's going to happen in the future, or.
No,
It can happen in the future if we decide to.
no, I mean, the point that Dennis is making and the question you're asking did occur to me. Miss Sally is focused on the contribution side of reporting. But if you want to move forward with gathering more facts, or you want me to ask for preliminary, so I only asked for preliminary information relating to the contribution side of things, because that's what Miss Sally. I actually did in the letter provide a hint that if there was an investigation, it might relate to the expenditure side, because I recognize that the issue you just raised could be a question for some commission members. So it's sort of a question of how do you want to go forward? Do you want to seek like authorized investigation? Do you want to ask them to address it in a preliminary way because they really weren't invited to do that before? Do you want to ask for a little bit more information about the funding relationship? I mean, if you, because not a lot is being offered. I don't mean to say that suspiciously, but I just like, there's a clear statement, there was no pledge or promise, but there's no really further explanation unless Mr. Vanderhulst would like to provide it now. Was there some sort of reliance? You could ask for that in writing, or you could ask it now. You have a lot of options. Yeah.
Mr. Vanderhulst, is there anything you'd like to add along those lines?
I don't think so. I mean, as Mr. Wayne says, the complaint was directed towards the contribution, again, which has been disclosed. The identity of the individual is fully disclosed, fully out there. Our 48-hour independent expenditure report was timely filed based on the expenditure, and again, not on dissemination, as again, I don't have that date, but it was obviously, we were basing it obviously well in advance of when it would air, because we're cognizant of that rule. But yeah, obviously we're happy to provide whatever information the commission needs.
Yeah, I think the complaint, I think implicitly was pointing out some kind of scheduling potential issues with when the contribution was received or pledged and when the ads were made and paid for and disseminated. And I think those are the kind of questions that the complaint raises.
Well, I guess on that note, I think one thing that would be helpful is, again, there's built in, I guess, deadlines and periods that are just in the rules. One of them being the registration. I believe there's and Ms. Burke should correct me. I believe there's a timeline after which registration needs to be made. After,
Yeah, I think she said it needs to be made a week.
I think that's the initial report.
Right.
But the registration itself, because the initial report is 7 days after registration.
Right.
Registration itself doesn't need to occur until is it 10 days or 7 days after? Is it 7?
7.
So there's there's a 2-week period in there before registration is required, and then before the initial report is required.
Yep.
So there's a 2-week period, sure, during which activity is taking place. That's the whole point of that period, and that was all disclosed on the initial report. And then I'm not sure if this is helpful, and I would have to look, but there were those digital ads. It's in most likely, and what was reported on the 48-hour, I thought that was in these materials. It's possible and probably even likely that the 48-hour, that the October expenditure was then for dissemination in TV form. And I just don't have it off the top of my head that they could have just been disseminating and I may just not have been privy to this, disseminating the same ad just by TV now, whereas before they only did it digitally, that takes no time.
Commissioner Hastings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just wondering, in fairness to Mr. Vanderholtz, the complaint before us is entirely focused on the contribution. And if we're going to delve into other areas, I wonder if we should give him a little more notice and opportunity to put information together and respond to us. I think it's a little bit unfair to put him on the spot on other issues that weren't part of the complaint at this point. I'm not sure we're going to get good information anyhow, because there's no reason he should have been prepared for that.
Right.
I always have good information. I'm always have.
Your advice is very wise, Commissioner Hastings. Yep. Any other thoughts from commissioners?
I'd like to continue this and ask the commission to investigate it.
Yeah. Do you want to make a motion?
Can I make a motion?
You may.
Continue this and ask the commission to investigate further. Put this on.
A subsequent meeting date.
What about the idea of, sort of us seeking out relevant information that's sort of at an intermediate level of depth for us to present back to you at your November 30th meeting?
Sure.
And then you could make and then if you feel like further fact finding is necessary, then we could move on to
an investigation.
Farther, more requests.
I think
I don't want to modify what you have in mind.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant by investigation. I used the wrong word.
No, I just mean it sort of, investigation can mean a lot of things, and it can ultimately be
fair enough. Yep.
Very in depth and intrusive. And
right.
I wasn't sure that you really wanted us to
I
go
don't
that
think
far.
that's the intention.
Yeah.
It's not,
Okay. Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm.
Okay.
Great.
So my motion is for the commission to do that.
Do what he said.
Do what Mr. Wayne said.
Is there a second? I'll second that specific motion. Is there any other discussion?
I missed some of that. What is the motion directing?
The motion is for Mr. Wayne to kind of gather some more information and re-present this to us at the November meeting.
And is
Information
about the complaint and the situation surrounding the complaint.
And the independent expenditure.
Is it about the is it about a possible violation of the reporting?
Yes.
There's an implied complaint in Miss Sally's.
Yes, I think there is.
And so is that what we're asking Mr. Wayne's staff to investigate?
Yes, I think that's right.
Okay, so I think we should probably be clear on that.
I'm sorry, it's not clear to me what.
I think it will be once Mr. Wayne contacts you. Yeah.
So will there be a sewer, what's the word for it? So will there be an additional, is this complaint, is the complaint we're looking at now taken care of? Will this be at like a commission initiated
We're
investigation?
we're deferring consideration of this complaint for a month for Mr. Wayne to do some more kind of looking into it.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Can I
I understand.
about what I was?
You may.
So what I would anticipate, Mr. Vanderhulst, is the staff would send you correspondence asking for additional factual information relating to whether or not a promised contribution was made, and the factual information we would be seeking is a little bit more meat on the bones in terms of what's the funding relationship between Mr. Klingenstein and the PAC, so that the commissioners are in a better position to know whether or not further investigation is necessary in terms of whether the contribution reporting is complete. That would be one of the two issues. The second issue would be the reported expenditure date of October 5th, and whether that is plausible, given that the ads, according to Ms. Sally, were, I think, available on October 7th. Is it possible that the PAC did not enter into an obligation or an agreement to pay for those ads prior to October 5th? Those would be the kinds of questions that we would be seeking additional information on. Your written response would be presented to the commissioners at the November 30th meeting. And then at that point, they would decide whether or not they need any further information. That would be my intention, if that's acceptable to the commission.
Yes, that makes perfect sense.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you for that clarification. So it's been moved and seconded, what Jonathan said. Any further discussion? Okay, we'll hold a roll call vote. Commissioner Newman.
Yes.
Commissioner Marvel.
Yes.
Commissioner Hastings.
Yes.
Commissioner Leclerc.
Yes.
And I'll vote yes as well. So we're deferring this for a month, and Mr. Wayne is going to look into it a little further. Thank you, Mr. Vanderhulst, for coming. Thank you, Ms. Sally, for coming. We always appreciate more information from folks who are involved.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to agenda item 5.
So some of the commission's rules are considered to be major substantive, which means if the commission wants to amend the rules, it should happen according to a particular schedule. And then the amendments are presented to the legislature for it to decide whether or not they approve of the commission's rule amendments. And so we have 4 topics in mind that would be appropriate for major substantive rulemaking. 3 of them were in the original packet. They relate to the procedures that the commission uses when it holds hearings, and what kind of notice is required and what kind of evidence may be admitted. Then there's a policy on whether or not the commission can or should return qualifying contributions to candidates. And then there's another topic is when a candidate replaces another candidate who has withdrawn, particularly around July of the election year, what is the qualifying period when the candidate can try to qualify for making election funding, and how much flexibility do we have to set that qualifying period? And then there was a correction that we realized we had hoped to make in our rules that we sent yesterday after business hours, which relates to can make election candidates spend their public campaign funds on post-election parties. And there was a statute change that says that's forbidden. So we would simply like to update our rules.
We shouldn't spend taxpayer money on candidate fund money.
It was legal for a long time, and then the legislature decided that was not appropriate. So I won't go into the ideas in more detail than that because it's been in materials, but we'd like to suggest moving forward with rulemaking. Our proposal on the scheduling is that we would be inviting comments from the public in the first week of November. They could either submit the comments in writing, or they could present them to you orally at a public hearing. We would schedule the oral hearing for your next meeting on November 30th, where if anyone was moved to, they would come and offer you their comments. There would be a written comment deadline after that public hearing. And then this would come back to you on December 21st for you to decide whether you wanted to make these amendments, either as they were originally proposed or modified, or sometimes the commission wants to withdraw them and not adopt them. But any amendments that were adopted at the December 21st meeting by this commission would be considered provisionally adopted, and that means they would be submitted to the legislature for its approval. And I'm sorry about Mr. Bolton is actually advises the Secretary of State's office, which has a role in this. So I hope I've used the right terminology in describing the different steps, but excellent. Yeah, thank you. So
He didn't hit you, so.
yeah. Yeah, so that's what we'd like to propose.
Is this, I have a couple of little edits on
Yeah.
one of these. Is this the time to discuss those or no?
I would say so. Yes.
Okay. In the 94-270, chapter 3, page 5, returns of qualifying contributions. It's paragraph N, November. I would change the are not returnable, or I would change that to nor. And I also wondered if in the next line, it's talking about if the commission receives a meritorious request. I don't know if you, do you want to be in the business of deciding what is meritorious and what's not?
Well, usually that's a good question.
You mean something that meets the requirements of the contractor doing that?
Well, there may have been a better way to phrase this, and I was trying to figure out the best way to do it, and I came up with the adjective meritorious. So I'll just tell you what I had in mind, which is that most of the time when the contributor who originally gave the $5 wants to ask for the money back, it's because either they've made a duplicate contribution, or I mean, that's the predominant reason. Possibly there are situations where they gave in a wrong amount or something like that. In other words, what I was trying to get at here is if there'd be sort of a screening process where if the contributor has a valid reason to ask for it to be returned to them like that, we would move forward with asking Inform Me to make the return. If it was a frivolous request by someone for the return of money, which we tend not to get, I just didn't want to lock us into arranging for a return of contribution if it didn't have merit. That's what I was getting at, is that, and we would make that judgment at the staff level. But if there's a better way to get at that, I'm happy to do it.
You could say something like the commission will decide whether or not to forward requests to the contractor.
The commission at its sole
Just leave
discretion.
it. Yeah,
Maybe the commission at its sole discretion
yeah.
can, I want to say can forward. Or may
Yeah,
forward, may.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be
Something
great.
like that.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
I just didn't know, I didn't know if
Get
you
away
wanted
from
to
that
be
judgment,
in the
yeah.
business of saying, right,
Yeah.
you deserve it and you don't.
Right. Well, I mean, most of the time we do it because there's a valid reason.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I was just trying, sort of covering us, give us the discretion in case someone came forward with it.
Right, right.
Could you maybe give an example of meritorious requests such as a contribution made in error? Or
Yeah, we can add that in.
Commissioner Hastings.
You know, we're talking about the return of a $5 contribution.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I certainly don't think the commission needs to get involved, that we should allow the staff to deal with it as it sees fit pretty much and not worry about it. As Jonathan said, if it wasn't for the fact that they've already deposited this money with the state, they might do it routinely with everybody, but, and they can do it with the credit card one. So it seems to me, whatever he comes up with that makes staff happy, we should be happy with ourselves and not have to worry about it as a commission.
I agree 100%.
More wise counsel,
point.
Commissioner
Good
Hastings.
point.
All right, so I think what you would like is a motion to move forward with these into the rulemaking. Yes.
I have a
Commissioner.
question about the late file, the one on the last page, page 6, sorry. the amendments.
Yep.
And again, sort of just with the language, I understand the intent, I just wonder, So if a candidate dies, withdraws, or is disqualified before an election, the commission will establish a qualifying period during which any replacement candidate may become a participating candidate, et cetera, et cetera. Can you just tell me, practically speaking, how that would work? I guess I'm wondering how candidates get, no, I'm not saying all this should be in the rule. I guess I'm just wondering how candidates would therefore get notice from you, from the commission, so as to make sure they're in compliance with this and.
So we're not a part of the, and I would gladly seek help from Mr. Bolton or from my colleagues, but so what happens is once a candidate withdraws, or unfortunately if a candidate passes away, there's some sort of, it's viewed as a vacancy. Replacement candidates become known or candidates who might want to replace the withdrawing candidate become aware that has happened. And then the caucuses, the local party committees have a nominating caucus, which is when these party activists nominate the person as a replacement candidate. And generally, these replacement candidates find out on their own information about what are the different options for financing a campaign. So this is sort of general knowledge out there in the candidate world that they can either go traditional and raise their own campaign contributions, or there's this optional public funding program. And so usually they contact us and they say, I have some interest in being an election night candidate. What do I have to do? What's the timing of that? And then we give them advice. Is that what you mean? Or
Yeah, I guess I want to make sure that it's, it's not on the commission to do any extra work, and it may be that this language covers it. I just want to make sure that, in other words, the onus is going to be on the new candidate, placement candidate, to contact the commission and say, hey, I'm looking into this, and the commission can say, okay, you can start tomorrow or next week or whatever.
Yeah,
Is that right?
we really appreciate your consideration on that. I mean, in the case of the July withdrawals, it's sort of a known process. It's something that people in politics know about. So we know we have to figure out what a replacement period might look like. But on these other more rare situations, thanks for the consideration, but we feel like they have to come forward and seek our assistance, and there's no burden on us to have to educate people or seek them out or things like that.
They seek you out.
Yeah.
I would also add that the parties get very involved in special elections, so they usually have a field director who kind of takes their hand, and the field directors are in good communication with us, so they know how to get them started on the process.
That leaves us independent, so it's out again, kind of
That's
drifting.
great. Thanks for that clarification.
I remember you calling me.
I'll never forget.
So you're looking for direction from us to go ahead with the rulemaking process?
Yes.
Yeah. I'll move that we go ahead with the rulemaking process with these recommendations.
Second.
Any other discussion? Okay, let's have a roll call. Commissioner Newman,
Yes.
Commissioner Marvel? Yes. Commissioner Hastings,
Yes.
Commissioner Leclerc?
Yes.
I also vote yes. Any other business?
No, other than we are in this period where the commission is required to meet within 2 business days.
Could be
of-
back.
Of a complaint unless the parties agree otherwise. So we haven't heard anything in the works, but we can always be surprised. So we'll be in touch.
Okay, or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We appreciate the extra work you've all been doing lately.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very
yeah, I'm sure it's been hectic.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the work it doesn't relate to the complaints. It's just
Right,
Getting,
right,
making the
right.
election act funds out, it's
Right.
receiving independent expenditure reports,
Right.
chasing down the right paperwork,
Yeah.
answering questions. That's all wrapped up.
Well, and it's essential to the process.
Yeah.
I think you guys are amazing.
Yeah, real.
And thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'll move that we adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
It doesn't need a vote. It does need a vote. It does need a vote. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Commissioner Newman?
Yes.
It's not debatable. Okay, that's what I was looking for. Yes. Commissioner Hastings,
Yes.
Commissioner Leclerc,
Yes.
and thank you all for attending, for your thoughtful comments and work on these questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Creating more accidents.
Goodbye.
Running out.
Bye, David.